I always liked camping. Something about being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees, the quiet hum of the forest, and the crackle of a campfire gave me peace. Life back in the city had become too loud, too fast, and too damn stressful. Work piled up on my desk every week, and I could barely keep my head above water. So, I figured a weekend alone in the woods might be what I needed. Just a tent, a sleeping bag, some basic supplies, and solitude. I planned it well, picked a spot in the middle of nowhere, a few hours' drive from home. It wasn't an official campsite. I had no interest in staying somewhere with noisy groups of hikers or families. I wanted quiet. I had my gear, a map, and enough food for a couple of days. The drive was easy. The weather was clear, the late autumn air crisp but not freezing. I parked my car at the edge of a dirt trail, threw my pack over my shoulder, and started hiking. The trail wasn't marked on most maps, but I had found it on an old forum where people shared off-the-grid camping spots. They said it was peaceful, rarely used, and far from any towns or major roads. The hike was rougher than I expected. The trail wasn't well maintained, and fallen branches and thick brush slowed me down. Still, I liked the challenge. After about 2 hours of walking, I found a clearing that seemed perfect. A small patch of flat ground surrounded by tall pines, with a stream nearby. I could hear the water trickling over rocks, which was reassuring. Water meant I wouldn't have to rely entirely on what I brought with me. I set up my tent quickly. The sun was already dipping below the trees, and the shadows stretched longer across the ground. I gathered some wood for a fire and got it going just as the last light faded. The flames danced, crackling softly, and I settled into my camp chair with a thermos of hot coffee. For the first couple of hours, it was everything I'd hoped for. Peaceful, calm, the kind of quiet you don't get in the city. I watched the fire, listened to the woods, and let my thoughts wander. But as the night grew deeper, the woods changed. It wasn't immediate. At first, I just noticed how dark it had gotten, the kind of dark that swallows everything beyond the firelight. The stars were out, but they barely cut through the thick canopy of trees above me. Then the sounds changed. In the early evening, the forest had been alive with noise. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot as some small animal moved through the underbrush. But now it was dead silent. Not a single sound, except for the crackle of my fire and the soft babble of the stream. Felt wrong. I tried to shake it off. I'd read before that forests can go quiet at night, especially if a predator is nearby. Maybe there was a fox or a coyote in the area. Nothing dangerous to a human, I told myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I glanced into the darkness beyond the firelight. My eyes strained to see anything, but the blackness was impenetrable. I told myself to stop being paranoid, but my body didn't listen. My pulse quickened, and my breath felt shallow. I stood up, pacing around the fire, trying to calm myself. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. Something felt off. I scanned the tree line again, my ears straining for any sound. That's when I heard it. A single snap of a branch somewhere in the woods behind me. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, deliberate. I froze, listening. My eyes darted back and forth, trying to pinpoint the source. I couldn't see anything, but I knew what I'd heard. It wasn't the random crack of a falling branch or the scurry of a squirrel. It was heavier than that. Something or someone had stepped on it. I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. Maybe it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. They could move quietly most of the time, but they weren't perfect. I picked up my flashlight and pointed it into the woods, sweeping the beam back and forth. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I told myself again that it was nothing, but my gut wasn't buying it. I couldn't just sit back down and ignore it. I grabbed my hatchet from beside the tent and kept it close. I wasn't planning to use it, but holding it made me feel a little better. I added more wood to the fire, making the flames jump higher, casting more light around my campsite. For the next hour, I sat there, staring into the woods, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I started to relax. Maybe I had imagined it. I was tired from the hike, after all, and being alone in the woods can mess with your head. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and I decided it was time to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. The forest was still eerily quiet, but I told myself it didn't matter. I was inside now, and the fire would keep any animals away. Sleep didn't come easy. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, my mind replaying that sound over and over. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jolt awake, convinced I'd heard something outside. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a restless sleep. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up, it was pitch black in the tent. The kind of dark where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. And something was outside. I heard it clearly. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my tent. They were light but unmistakable. Not the shuffling of an animal, but the measured steps of a person. My heart was in my throat. I lay there, barely breathing, listening as the footsteps moved around me. They'd stop for a few seconds, then start again, crunching softly on the leaves and twigs. Whoever it was, they were just outside the thin layer of nylon that separated me from the darkness. I clenched the hatchet in my hand, my palms slick with sweat. My mind raced. What should I do? Yell? Stay quiet? Wait for them to leave? The footsteps stopped, right outside the tent. I could hear my own heartbeat, thudding in my chest, drowning out everything else. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again. This time moving away, fading into the woods. I lay there, frozen, for at least another hour, straining to hear any sound. But there was nothing. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept into the tent. I unzipped the flap cautiously, peering out. The campsite looked exactly as I'd left it. No signs of anyone or anything around. But just a few feet from my tent, I saw them. Footprints. Not animal tracks. Human. They circled my tent twice before disappearing into the woods. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear in record time, doused the fire, and threw everything into my pack. My hands were shaking as I tightened the straps and hoisted it onto my back. I didn't even stop for breakfast. The hike back to the car felt like it took forever. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had my head whipping around. I kept expecting to see someone standing just off the trail, watching me, but I didn't see anyone. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack into the back seat, jumped in, and locked the doors. My fingers fumbled with the keys, but I finally got the engine started. I didn't breathe easy until I was miles away from that place. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just some random hiker who stumbled across my campsite. Maybe they were lost or curious, or maybe they weren't. All I know is I won't be going back. Not to that spot. Not to any spot that remote. Sometimes solitude isn't what you need. Sometimes being alone in the woods is the last place you want to be. And sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't a wild animal. It's another person. I don't know why I decided to camp alone that weekend. Looking back, it feels like the stupidest thing I've ever done. Maybe it was because I needed a break from everything. The constant noise, the suffocating work deadlines, the way life just piles up until it feels like you're drowning. I thought a couple of days in the mountains would clear my head. Just me, a tent, a fire, and the silence of the woods. I had camped before, never alone, but I wasn't a total rookie. I knew how to set up a tent, start a fire, and read a map. The spot I picked was deep in the woods, about 2 hours off any marked trail. That's what I wanted. No crowds, no noise, just raw nature. It was mid-October, and the weather was perfect, cool during the day, chilly at night. The leaves were turning golden and red, covering the forest floor in a thick blanket. I parked my truck at a dirt pull-off and hiked in with everything I needed. Tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, water, a small stove, and a knife clipped to my belt. I even brought a little first aid kit just in case. I felt prepared, confident even. The first day was peaceful. I found a nice flat spot near a creek, surrounded by tall pines and maples. The sound of the water was soothing. I set up camp, built a small fire, and spent the afternoon exploring the area. I didn't see a single person, just how I wanted it. As the sun started to set, I cooked some instant noodles on my little stove, ate them by the fire, and watched the sky turn from orange to deep purple. The temperature dropped quickly once it got dark. I tossed a few more logs on the fire and sat there for a while, enjoying the warmth. When I finally crawled into my tent, it was almost 10 p.m. The air was cold and crisp, and I pulled my sleeping bag tight around me. I lay there for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the babbling creek. It was calming at first, but then it hit me. I was completely alone, miles from the nearest person. I pushed the thought out of my head. There was nothing to be afraid of. I'd be fine. I woke up around 2 a.m., heart racing. Something had snapped me out of sleep. A sound, sharp and quick, like a twig breaking. I held my breath, straining to hear. The forest was dead silent now. No wind, no owls, just a thick, heavy quiet. Then I heard it again. A crunch, soft but deliberate. Footsteps. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe a raccoon sniffing around my campsite. But deep down, I knew those weren't the clumsy steps of an animal. They were too slow, too measured. I lay there in my sleeping bag, every muscle tense. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and steady, crunching through the leaves. Whoever it was, whatever it was, they were right outside. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My heart was hammering in my chest so loud I was sure they could hear it. The footsteps stopped directly behind my tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Minutes passed, then more minutes. I lay there, frozen, listening, waiting. Finally, the footsteps started again, this time moving away, fading into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, listening for any sign that they might come back. By morning, I had convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a hiker had wandered too close to my campsite and left when they realized someone was there. Creepy, sure, but not impossible. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I packed up my camp, planning to head back to the truck, but something stopped me. I didn't want to leave. Not yet. I told myself I was being paranoid. I had come all this way for some peace and quiet, and I wasn't going to let a little scare ruin it. So I decided to stay one more night. I spent the day hiking and trying to enjoy myself, but the tension never left my chest. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every shadow between the trees looked like a figure watching me. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous. By the time the sun started to set again, I felt exhausted, mentally and physically. I built another fire, cooked some food, and tried to relax. The warmth of the fire helped a little, but that feeling of being watched never really went away. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in my sleeping bag, knife in hand, staring at the roof of my tent, waiting. Around 3 a.m., the footsteps came back. This time, there was no mistaking it. They were slow and heavy, circling my tent again. My blood turned to ice. They stopped right next to the tent, just like before. I could hear them breathing, low, steady breaths. Then something pressed against the side of the tent, right near my head. I could see the fabric push in slightly, like a hand was resting on it. I wanted to scream, to lash out with the knife, but I was too scared to move. The hand, or whatever it was, lingered for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as slowly as it had appeared, it pulled away. The footsteps started again, moving toward the woods. I waited until the sound had completely faded, then grabbed my flashlight and crawled out of the tent, knife still in my hand. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow over the campsite. I scanned the trees with my flashlight, my breath visible in the cold air. Nothing, but the ground around my tent told a different story. Footprints, clear as day, circling my tent over and over. They weren't animal tracks, they were boots. I didn't wait for the sun to rise. I packed up my gear in record time, heart pounding the whole time. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. The hike back to my truck was the longest 2 hours of my life. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves sent my pulse into overdrive. I kept my knife in my hand the entire time. When I finally reached the truck, I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. As I drove down the dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I didn't stop until I was back in town, sitting in a diner with a cup of coffee in front of me, surrounded by people and noise. Only then did I start to feel safe again. I never found out who or what was out there with me that night. I told myself it was probably some messed up prank, some weirdo trying to scare campers for fun. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. The plan seemed simple enough. Head out to the mountains, spend a quiet weekend camping, and clear my mind. I'd done this before plenty of times. Nothing too remote, just far enough from the city to find some peace. I needed the solitude after the long weeks at work. I packed everything I thought I'd need: my tent, sleeping bag, a reliable knife, food, water, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a weatherproof jacket. The weather forecast predicted chilly nights but otherwise clear skies. I tossed it all into the back of my SUV and headed out late Friday afternoon. The drive to the campsite was peaceful. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the trees. I rolled down my window, breathing in the fresh air and letting the hum of my tires on the pavement clear my mind. Soon, the paved road turned to gravel, and the forest swallowed the sky. I was in my element. I found a spot just off the main trail, tucked away enough to feel secluded but close enough to the path in case I needed to leave quickly. The ground was relatively flat, and there was a fire ring left by campers before me. Perfect. I set up camp as the light faded. By the time I had my tent pitched and firewood gathered, the sun had set. The first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. I lit a small fire and warmed up some canned soup, sitting back in my folding chair with a deep sigh. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant rustle of leaves. Felt good, peaceful. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. The air had turned colder, and the fire was dying down. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and turned off my flashlight. Darkness wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest. Owls hooted in the distance, and leaves whispered in the breeze. It was calming at first until I heard something new. It started faint, a soft crunch of leaves. Then another. Footsteps. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. I stayed still, listening closely. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves just beyond the light of my dying fire. Then they stopped. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear something, anything, but there was nothing, just the sound of the wind in the trees. I told myself it was probably an animal passing through and eventually drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me. It was the feeling of being watched. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct I had was screaming at me that something wasn't right. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The inside of my tent was empty, of course, but that did little to calm my nerves. I unzipped the tent and shined the light outside. The fire had burned down to embers, barely illuminating the surrounding trees. I swept the flashlight around, searching for the source of my unease. Nothing. The forest was quiet again, almost unnaturally so. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I stood there for a while, listening, but the feeling didn't go away. Finally, I crawled back into my tent, leaving the flashlight on beside me. Sleep didn't come easily after that. When dawn finally broke, I stepped out of my tent, relieved to see the sun again. The forest felt normal again in the daylight, calm and peaceful. I made some coffee on my portable stove, convincing myself that I had overreacted the night before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there. I decided to take a walk around my campsite, just to put my mind at ease. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not animal tracks, human footprints. They circled my campsite, stopping just a few feet from my tent before disappearing back into the woods. A cold chill ran down my spine. I wasn't alone last night. I told myself it could have been another camper, maybe someone who got lost and stumbled across my site. But the tracks didn't lead toward the main trail. They led deeper into the woods, and there were no other campsites nearby. I tried to shake it off. After all, what could I do? Pack up and leave? I'd driven hours to get here, and it was probably just some harmless passerby. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I spent the rest of the day sticking close to camp, chopping firewood, reading, and keeping my eyes on the tree line. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, that sense of unease returned. By the time darkness fell again, I was on edge. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on fire. I kept my flashlight and knife close, the fire blazing higher than it had the night before. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Slowly, I began to relax. Maybe I'd been overreacting after all. Then I heard it. The footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my heart hammering in my chest. I shined the light into the darkness, scanning the trees. The footsteps stopped. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. No response. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, just as I was about to lower the flashlight, I saw something move between the trees. A shadow, just at the edge of the light's reach. It was a person. Panic surged through me. This wasn't some lost hiker. Whoever it was had been watching me. I backed toward my tent, keeping the light trained on the spot where I'd seen the figure. My mind raced. Should I run? Hide? Confront them? Before I could decide, the figure stepped closer, just barely visible in the light. I couldn't make out their face, but they were tall, wearing dark clothing, and they weren't moving like someone who needed help. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my car keys from inside the tent and bolted. Branches whipped against my face as I sprinted toward my SUV, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I didn't dare look back. I reached the car, yanked the door open, and jumped inside. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel as I backed out onto the trail. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. My heart was still racing, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Whoever that was, they'd been watching me all night. They'd circled my tent, waited for me to fall asleep, and then come back the next night. I never found out who they were or what they wanted. I didn't go back for my tent or any of my gear. It wasn't worth it. Even now, months later, I can't sleep without double-checking that all my doors are locked. Every time I hear a strange noise outside, my mind goes back to that night in the woods. Some people say camping is the best way to disconnect and find peace. Maybe they're right, but after that weekend, I'll stick to finding peace at home, behind locked doors. I've always loved the outdoors. Nothing clears my head like getting away from the noise of the city and heading deep into the woods where the only sounds are the wind in the trees and the crunch of leaves underfoot. It's peaceful, at least it used to feel that way. Last fall, I decided to take a solo camping trip. I'd done plenty of solo hikes and weekend camps before, so I wasn't worried. In fact, I was excited. The plan was simple. Hike 10 miles into a quiet stretch of forest, set up camp by a small river I'd found on a map, and stay there for 2 nights before heading back. I wasn't too far from civilization, maybe a 3-hour drive from home, but once I hit the trail, it felt like I'd stepped into another world. I got to the trailhead around noon. The sky was a bright, clear blue, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. Perfect hiking weather. My pack was loaded with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, a couple of MREs, water, my knife, and a small first aid kit. I wasn't worried about running into trouble. This was a well-maintained trail, and I checked the weather beforehand. No storms in sight. The first few hours of hiking were uneventful. I passed a couple of other hikers coming back the opposite way, exchanged a quick nod with them, and kept moving. I made good time and reached the river just before sunset. It was a beautiful spot. Tall trees surrounded the water, their leaves just starting to turn yellow and orange. The river was calm, only a few feet wide, and I found a flat, grassy area nearby that looked perfect for setting up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped quickly. I wrapped myself in my jacket, cooked a quick meal over the fire, and leaned back to enjoy the quiet. The first night was uneventful. I slept well, waking up only once to the distant howl of a coyote. Nothing unusual. I'd heard coyotes before. They usually keep their distance from humans. I drifted back to sleep, feeling safe and comfortable in my little tent. The next morning, I decided to do some exploring. I left most of my gear at the campsite, taking only my knife, a bottle of water, and a small snack. I followed the river upstream for about an hour, cutting through dense undergrowth and climbing over fallen logs. The deeper I went, the thicker the forest became. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen any signs of other hikers for a while. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. That wasn't too strange. This wasn't a popular trail, but it gave me an odd feeling. Not fear exactly, just a sense that I was very, very alone. I stopped to drink some water and catch my breath. That's when I noticed it. A faint smell in the air, something sour and metallic. It reminded me of rust or blood. I looked around, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The smell was faint and seemed to come and go with the breeze. I told myself it was probably just a dead animal somewhere nearby. I kept walking for a little while longer, but the smell lingered in the back of my mind. Eventually, I decided to turn back. I wasn't lost, but I didn't want to push my luck by wandering too far from camp. When I got back, the sun was high overhead, and the air was warm. My tent was still there, my fire pit untouched. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. Still, that smell bothered me. Couldn't shake it. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering more firewood and fishing in the river. By the time evening rolled around, I felt better. Whatever I'd smelled earlier was probably long gone. I cooked another meal, sat by the fire for a while, and then crawled into my tent. That night, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was something else. A soft, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was faint, but it was definitely there. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and close. They circled around my campsite, stopping every few seconds before starting again. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps kept moving, always just outside my line of sight. I thought about unzipping the tent and shining my flashlight outside, but something stopped me. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. I waited, barely breathing, but the footsteps didn't start again. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, I convinced myself that whatever it was had left. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal, curious about the smell of my fire. That made sense, didn't it? Still clutching my knife, I lay back down and closed my eyes. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent, feeling groggy and on edge. The campsite looked normal, no tracks, no signs of anything unusual. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. Lack of sleep can do weird things to your mind. I was packing up my gear, getting ready to head back early, when I noticed something on the ground a few feet from my tent. It was a footprint. Not a boot print or a shoe print, a bare footprint. Human. It was large, wider than my own foot, and pressed deep into the soft dirt. My stomach dropped. I wasn't alone out here. I grabbed my pack and slung it over my shoulder, my pulse racing. I didn't care about breakfast or packing neatly. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I started back down the trail at a fast pace, constantly checking over my shoulder. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. About an hour into my hike, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time coming from behind me. I froze, listening. The footsteps were faster now, closer. I broke into a run, my pack bouncing against my back. The trail blurred around me as I sprinted, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see who or what was following me. Eventually, the trailhead came into view. My car was parked in the small gravel lot, the only vehicle there. I ran straight for it, fumbling with my keys before finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. I locked the doors and sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. My clothes were soaked with sweat. I started the engine and peeled out of the lot, not slowing down until I was miles away. I never did figure out who left that footprint or why they were following me. But I haven't gone camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Nothing fancy, just me, a backpack, and a tent. I wanted some quiet, something to break the monotony of work and city noise. No people, no responsibilities, just trees, fresh air, and a bit of solitude. I picked a spot a few hours away from the city, a quiet stretch of forest I'd read about online. It wasn't an official campground, more like a dispersed camping area. But that was exactly what I wanted. A real escape. I packed light. Sleeping bag, tent, a camp stove, some instant meals, a water filter, flashlight, extra batteries, knife, lighter, and enough clothes for a couple of chilly nights. My phone was fully charged, but I knew I wouldn't have service out there. That didn't bother me. In fact, it was part of the appeal.
No distractions.
Just nature. I parked my car at the edge of an old logging road and hiked in about 3 miles before finding a spot that felt right. It wasn't anything special, just a flat piece of ground tucked between a couple of tall pines. There was a small clearing with just enough room for my tent, and the tree canopy above was thick enough to keep most of the light out. Felt secluded, quiet, peaceful. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent and laying out my gear. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant chirp of birds. After everything was set up, I sat down on a fallen log and just breathed. Felt good to be away from everything. The first few hours were uneventful. I explored the area a bit, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees and down toward a small creek. The water was cold and clear, and I filled up my water bottle using the filter I'd brought. As I walked back to camp, I noticed how quiet it had gotten. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears, making every little sound, your footsteps, the crack of a branch, seem louder than it should be. By late afternoon, I had a small fire going. I boiled some water and made a cup of instant coffee, then sat by the fire and watched the light fade. The forest around me slowly turned from green to gray, and the shadows stretched longer and longer until they swallowed everything. I wasn't scared, just aware. Aware of how alone I was. Aware of how small and insignificant I felt out here, surrounded by miles and miles of trees. I told myself that was part of the experience. This was why I came out here, to feel something different, to push myself a little. But as the last light drained from the sky, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't explain it. Nothing had happened. There were no strange sounds, no distant footsteps, no reason to feel the way I did. But that feeling grew, creeping up the back of my neck and settling deep in my chest. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the warmth of the fire, the simple pleasure of being outside. I ate a quick meal, instant noodles and a protein bar, then sat there for a while watching the flames dance. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like awareness. Like my body was trying to tell me something my brain couldn't quite grasp. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I'd read too many stories about solo camping trips gone wrong. My imagination was getting the best of me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned off my flashlight to let my eyes adjust to the darkness, listening to the forest around me. Nothing. No footsteps. No rustling. Nothing to suggest I wasn't alone. And yet, I grabbed my knife and slipped it into my pocket, just in case. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the trees. I added another log, but it didn't help much. The light seemed weaker than before, barely enough to hold back the darkness. Then I heard it, a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. It was distant, but not distant enough. I froze, straining to hear. My heart was pounding now, the knife clutched tight in my hand. The sound didn't come again. I told myself it was a branch falling, maybe a deer moving through the trees. Nothing to worry about, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't either of those things. The fire flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. I stood up slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness. The forest seemed bigger than before, deeper somehow, like the trees had shifted when I wasn't looking. I stepped away from the fire, my boots crunching softly against the dirt. My flashlight was in my other hand, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I took a few steps toward the edge of the clearing, my breath shallow and quick. The forest felt alive around me, the shadows shifting and stretching like something was hiding just out of sight. Then I heard it again, closer this time. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a branch. It wasn't a deer. It was a footstep. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the darkness beyond the trees. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was another camper. Maybe someone else had the same idea, and they just hadn't seen my tent. But that didn't feel right. Why would they be walking around in the dark without a light? Why hadn't they called out? I reached the fire and grabbed another log, tossing it on to make the flames jump higher. The light pushed back the shadows a bit, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. Nothing but the crackle of the fire and the sound of my own breathing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe I'd heard an echo of my own footsteps earlier. Maybe it was a small animal and I'd blown it out of proportion. I stayed up a little longer, but the fire started to die down, and my body was exhausted from the tension. I crawled into my tent, leaving the knife within reach, and zipped the door shut. I lay there for a long time, listening to the night, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the forest stayed quiet. I must have drifted off eventually because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The light streamed through the trees, warm and golden, and the forest felt completely different, peaceful again, harmless. I stepped out of my tent, stretching and breathing in the cool morning air. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. Fire pit, backpack, food bag hanging from a tree. Nothing was out of place. But then I saw it. A single footprint pressed into the dirt just beyond the edge of my camp. It wasn't mine. It was too big, too wide, and it was fresh. I stared at it for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. Someone had been there. Someone had stood just outside my camp, watching. I packed up as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I stuffed my gear into my bag. I didn't bother with breakfast. I didn't bother with anything except getting the hell out of there. The hike back to my car felt like it took twice as long as it should have. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but I didn't see anything. When I finally reached my car, I threw my bag into the back seat and locked the doors before I even started the engine. I drove straight home, my mind racing the whole way. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe it was another camper who decided not to say anything. Or maybe it was something else entirely. I don't know. But I do know one thing. I won't be going back. I'm not one for long trips into the wilderness, but every once in a while, I get this itch to escape everything. No people, no emails, no notifications, just the quiet hum of nature. I had been planning this camping trip for weeks, hoping for some peace. Just me, a tent, and miles of empty forest. Perfect. I packed light tent, sleeping bag, some food, water, and a few basic tools. The trailhead was tucked deep in the national forest, far enough from the nearest town that my cell service dropped out long before I parked the truck. That was fine with me. I wasn't planning on talking to anyone anyway. I locked the truck, hoisted my backpack, and started up the trail. The first few miles were easy. Sunlight filtered through the treetops, birds chirped overhead, and the scent of pine filled the air. I felt good, relaxed, even. The trail wound upward through the hills, and after about an hour, I veered off the main path onto an old fire road I'd marked on my map. It wasn't a popular area for hikers, which was exactly what I wanted. By late afternoon, I'd found a nice flat spot near a small creek and set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and sat down to enjoy the quiet. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, thick and green. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the soft babble of the creek. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched long and dark. I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal, beans and some beef jerky. Nothing fancy, but it hit the spot. I leaned back, staring at the flames, letting my mind drift. That's when I noticed it. A sound. Faint at first, barely noticeable over the crackling fire and the creek's soft murmur. It was a snapping branch, sharp and distinct, coming from somewhere in the trees behind me. I froze, listening. The sound didn't repeat, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. I'd seen plenty of animals on hikes before, and most of them wanted nothing to do with humans. Still, I felt uneasy. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it over the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and branches, but nothing else. No glowing eyes, no movement. I shook my head and laughed at myself. You're being ridiculous. I doused the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped the door shut. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise outside seemed louder than it should have been. The wind in the leaves, the creak of old branches. I lay there, staring at the tent's ceiling, straining to hear something, anything that didn't belong. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. The next morning, the forest felt different. The sun was up, but the air felt heavy, the way it does before a storm. I stepped out of the tent and stretched, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. The fire pit was cold and dead, just as I'd left it, but something about the campsite felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. My gear was all where it should have been. Tent intact, backpack leaning against a tree. But the ground around the tent looked disturbed. There were shallow impressions in the dirt, like someone or something had been walking around in the night. Animal tracks, I told myself. Just a curious animal sniffing around. I grabbed my water bottle and headed for the creek to refill it. That's when I saw the footprint. It was half buried in the mud near the water's edge, but it was unmistakable. Asterisk, asterisk, a boot print. Asterisk, asterisk, not an animal. Person. My pulse quickened. I hadn't seen another soul since leaving the trailhead. No one should have been out here. I scanned the surrounding woods, my heart thudding in my chest. The print was fresh. Someone had been here watching my campsite while I slept. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost and stumbled across my camp. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. There was no reason for anyone to be this far off the main trail. I filled my bottle and headed back to camp, my eyes constantly scanning the trees. The feeling of being watched had settled deep in my gut, and no amount of logic could shake it. I decided to cut my trip short. I planned to stay for 2 nights, but something didn't feel right. I packed up my gear quickly, stuffing everything into my backpack with clumsy, nervous hands. The forest felt too quiet. I retraced my steps toward the trailhead, moving faster than I had on the way in. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my pulse spike. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. By midday, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool breeze. My legs burned from the constant uphill climb, but I didn't stop. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stopped, something bad would happen. About a mile from the trailhead, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps behind me. Not an animal. Footsteps. Human. Asterisk, asterisk, I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. The woods were still and silent. I stood there for a long moment, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My eyes darted from tree to tree, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. I turned and kept walking, my pace quickening with every step. The trees thinned out as I neared the trailhead, and finally, asterisk, asterisk, blessedly asterisk, asterisk, I saw my truck. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I reached the truck, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The driver's side door was open. I knew I'd locked it. I always lock it when I leave, but now it hung open, swinging gently in the breeze. I hesitated, scanning the parking area. It was empty, no other cars, no sign of anyone. I climbed into the truck, my hands shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw it into reverse, my eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the trees. As I sped down the gravel road, I kept expecting something or someone to step out in front of me, but nothing did. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, miles from the forest. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding. I never figured out who it was or what they wanted. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept my doors locked, double-checked the windows every night. Eventually, the fear faded, replaced by a nagging sense of unease. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, never that deep in the woods. I've told myself 100 times that it was probably nothing, maybe a lost hiker, maybe just my imagination running wild. But then I remember the boot print by the creek, and the open truck door, and I know someone was out there with me and they didn't want to be seen. I've always loved camping, being out in the wild, far from all the noise and stress of the city, is something that keeps me grounded. Usually I camp with a few friends, but that weekend, everyone bailed. Work, family commitments, you know how it is. I decided to go solo. I told myself it would be fine, just me and the woods. I've been camping dozens of times, so I felt confident I could handle it alone. Looking back now, that was my first mistake. I packed my usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a good knife, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a first aid kit. My plan was simple: drive out to the national forest, hike a few miles off the beaten path, and camp out for 2 nights. Nothing fancy, just peace and quiet. The drive took about 3 hours, and by the time I got there, the late afternoon sun was starting to dip below the treetops. I parked my car at the trailhead, locked it up, and strapped on my pack. The trail was familiar, one I'd hiked a couple of times before, but this time I planned to go a little deeper into the woods. I wanted to avoid running into other campers or hikers. The forest was beautiful that time of year, early fall with the leaves just starting to turn. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The trail wound through thick stands of trees, past a small creek that gurgled softly in the background. Everything felt calm, peaceful. After about 2 hours of hiking, I found the perfect spot to set up camp. A small clearing surrounded by tall pines. It was flat and dry with plenty of space for my tent. Best of all, it was far enough from the trail that I wouldn't be disturbed. I pitched my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and set up a little fire pit. By the time I had everything ready, the sun had almost set. I lit a fire, cooked a quick dinner, instant noodles and beef jerky, and settled in to enjoy the quiet. The first night passed without incident. I slept well, waking only once or twice to the distant sound of owls hooting. The next morning, I woke early, just as the first light was filtering through the trees. I made myself some coffee, ate a granola bar, and decided to explore the area a bit. I wandered through the woods, following the creek for a while before veering off into thicker forest. That's when I noticed the first odd thing. About a mile from my campsite, I found a small pile of bones. They looked like animal bones, deer maybe, but they were arranged in a strange, almost deliberate pattern. I've seen animal remains in the woods before, but this felt different. The bones were clean, too clean, like they'd been picked bare and left there recently. I stood there for a minute, staring at the pile, feeling a weird sense of unease. Eventually, I shook it off. Probably just some animal, or maybe another camper messing around. Either way, it wasn't worth worrying about. I kept walking for another hour before turning back toward camp. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every now and then, I'd stop and listen, but the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was high in the sky. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering firewood and reading a book by the fire. The weird feeling lingered, but I tried to ignore it. That night, things got worse. I went to bed around 10 p.m. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow around the campsite. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, branches creaking in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional rustle of leaves. Then I heard something else. It was faint at first, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound stopped. For a few seconds, everything was silent. Then it started again, closer this time. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around the tent, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness outside. I couldn't see anything. Probably just a deer, I told myself, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The footsteps were too deliberate, too steady. I sat there, clutching the flashlight, listening as the footsteps circled my tent. They were slow, methodical, like whoever or whatever was out there was taking their time. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just sat there, waiting. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it, a soft, scraping sound, like something dragging across the fabric of my tent. I froze. The sound moved slowly around the tent, pausing every few seconds before continuing. My mind raced. Should I yell? Should I make a run for it? I didn't know what to do. The scraping stopped. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I lay back down, clutching my knife, and somehow managed to fall asleep. I woke at first light, my body tense and aching from a night of bad sleep. My first thought was to pack up and get the hell out of there. Whatever had been outside my tent last night, I didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. I packed up quickly, stuffing my gear into my pack and dousing the fire. I kept my knife in my hand the whole time, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The hike back to the trailhead felt like a race. I moved fast, my heart pounding the whole time. Every sound made me jump. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. About halfway back, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A footprint. It was human but barefoot and much too large to be normal. The print was deep, pressed into the soft earth like whoever made it was heavy. I stared at it for a moment, my stomach twisting into knots. Then I turned and kept moving, faster now. The last mile felt like the longest of my life. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone following me, but the trail stayed empty. When I finally reached the car, I practically threw my pack into the back seat and jumped in. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, but I got the engine started and tore out of there as fast as I could. Back home, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe just some other camper messing around, or an animal I didn't recognize. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I haven't been camping alone since. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal. And it wasn't a person, at least not in the way we understand people. I still think about those footsteps sometimes, and the scraping sound outside my tent. I wonder what would have happened if I'd gone outside, or if I'd stayed another night. I'll never know, and honestly, I'm okay with that. I wasn't sure why I agreed to go camping that weekend. Maybe I just needed a break. Life had been wearing me down, and there was something about disappearing into the woods for a couple of days that seemed like the reset button I needed. My plan was simple: a solo camping trip deep in Black Ridge National Forest. I wanted quiet. No notifications, no emails, just me, a tent, and miles of wilderness. I packed everything: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, and a little old hunting knife I'd brought more for comfort than utility. My phone was charged, but I knew there wouldn't be any service where I was going. That was kind of the point. The drive to Black Ridge took me nearly 3 hours. The last stretch of road was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for my car. Dense trees leaned over the road like they were trying to block out the sky. I rolled down the window to get a breath of the cool air and let it fill the car. It smelled like pine and wet dirt. I pulled into a small dirt parking lot near the trailhead. My car was the only one there. That gave me a weird sense of relief, honestly. No noisy campers or screaming kids to ruin the peace. I slung my pack over my shoulder and locked the car. As I stood there, looking up at the trail ahead, the forest felt heavy, not threatening, just big, endless. I took a deep breath and started walking. The hike in was tougher than I expected. The trail wasn't well marked, and it kept winding uphill through thick clusters of trees. By the time I found a decent spot to set up camp, the sun was already dipping behind the ridgeline. I was sweaty, tired, and my legs ached. The spot I picked was a small clearing next to a stream. The water was cold and clear, running over smooth rocks. It seemed like the perfect place. Far enough off the trail to feel secluded, but close enough to the water to have everything I needed. I set up my tent quickly and built a small fire. Took longer than I thought it would to get it going, but once it caught, the warmth felt good. I sat there for a while, just staring into the flames, listening to the sound of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves. As the sky darkened, the forest around me came alive with sounds. Crickets chirped in steady rhythm, and something small scurried through the underbrush. Probably a rabbit, maybe a raccoon. I wasn't worried. Not yet. I ate a quick meal, just some trail mix and a protein bar, then crawled into my tent. The air was cold, but I zipped up my sleeping bag and felt warm enough. It didn't take long for sleep to take me. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping and sunlight filtering through the thin walls of my tent. I felt refreshed, rested in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. I made some instant coffee on my little camp stove and drank it slowly while sitting on a rock by the stream. I had no plans for the day except to explore the area and maybe take a few photos. By midday, I was deep in the woods, far from my camp. I wandered without any real direction, following game trails and crossing over fallen logs. I found an old deer stand, half collapsed and covered in moss. The forest was beautiful, almost untouched. But at some point, I realized I didn't know exactly how far I'd gone. The landscape all looked the same: thick trees and ferns, a carpet of pine needles underfoot. I wasn't panicking, but I knew I needed to head back. I turned around and started retracing my steps. That's when I noticed something strange. About 20 yards off the trail, there was a small pile of rocks. Not just random rocks, but stacked deliberately into a little tower. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong there. I walked over to get a closer look. The rocks were smooth and wet, almost like they'd been pulled from a riverbed. I didn't think much of it at first. People do weird things in the woods sometimes. Maybe it was just some hiker's idea of a marker. Still, it gave me a strange feeling, like I was being watched. I made my way back to camp, my footsteps a little faster than before. By the time I got back, the sun was low in the sky again. The forest seemed darker than it had the night before, the shadows longer, the air colder. I rebuilt my fire and sat close to it, the flickering flames making the trees around me dance. I kept thinking about that pile of rocks. It stuck in my mind in a way I couldn't explain. Something about it felt wrong, like it was a message I wasn't meant to understand. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I was just tired. Spending too much time alone can mess with your head. Still, I couldn't help glancing into the darkness beyond the firelight, half expecting to see something standing there. Eventually, I crawled into my tent. I left the fire burning low outside, just for a little extra light. Couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, a low, distant thump. At one point, I was sure I heard footsteps just outside my tent, slow and deliberate, circling. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. My heart was pounding in my chest. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a bear, nothing to worry about, but deep down I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and immediately froze. The fire had burned down to embers, but someone or something had been there while I slept. Around the edge of my camp, the ground was disturbed. Footprints, not boot prints like mine, but bare feet, human feet. They circled my tent in a wide arc, then disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at those footprints. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. No one should have been out there, not that far from the trail, not barefoot. A chill ran down my spine. I packed up camp in record time. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my gear into my pack. I didn't care about breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. I started back down the trail, moving as fast as I could without running. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. The trail seemed longer on the way back. My legs were burning, and sweat dripped into my eyes, but I didn't stop, couldn't. About halfway back, I found another pile of rocks, just like the first one, stacked neatly by the side of the trail. My stomach turned. I didn't stop to look at it. I just kept walking. By the time I reached the parking lot, my heart was hammering in my chest. My car was right where I left it, the only vehicle in sight. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a few minutes, catching my breath. The forest felt different now. Not peaceful, but oppressive, like it was watching me. I started the engine and drove away without looking back. I never went back to Black Ridge. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably nothing. Maybe another camper I hadn't noticed. Maybe a prank. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there with me. Something that wanted me to know it was there. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a sound outside my window, a branch tapping against the glass, or footsteps in the yard, and it all comes rushing back. I close the blinds, lock the doors, and wait for morning. I should have known better than to camp alone. Looking back, there were signs, but I ignored them, determined to prove to myself that I could handle it. I'd been stuck in a cycle of stress, day after day in the city, with noise and deadlines suffocating me. I thought spending a few nights alone in the woods would clear my head. Nature always had that effect on me. I planned everything down to the last detail, or so I thought. I packed my gear carefully. A tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food, water, a first aid kit, and my trusty multi-tool. I even carried a weatherproof map of the area. I'd chosen a spot in the national forest, far from any crowded campsites. I wanted isolation, peace. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. Stupid, I know. The hike started great. The late afternoon sun cut through the canopy, lighting the trail in patches of gold. The air smelled like pine and fresh earth. My pack felt heavy on my shoulders, but the weight was a reminder that I was out here on my own, fully independent. No phone signal.
No distractions.
Just me and the woods. After a couple of hours, I found a flat clearing beside a creek and decided it would be my campsite. The water trickled softly over smooth rocks, and tall trees surrounded the spot, their leaves whispering in the wind. Perfect. I pitched my tent quickly and gathered some dry wood for a fire. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. I lit the fire just as darkness crept in, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees. The first night was peaceful. I cooked some instant noodles over the fire and leaned back against a fallen log, staring up at the stars. I felt small under that vast sky, but in a comforting way. Out here, none of my usual problems mattered. My only job was to exist. I fell asleep to the sound of the creek and the crackling fire, feeling calm for the first time in months. The next morning, I woke up early. The air was cold and damp, and a thin layer of dew covered everything. I boiled some water for coffee and ate a protein bar while studying my map. I decided to hike further up the creek and explore the surrounding area. I left most of my gear behind, taking only the essentials: water, a snack, my knife, and the map. The forest was beautiful, the kind of beauty that feels ancient and untouched. The trail was less clear the further I went, but I didn't mind. I was just following the creek after all. About an hour into my hike, I started noticing odd things, little details that didn't sit right. First, there was a pile of rocks arranged in a perfect circle near the water's edge. Not a natural formation. It looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. I shrugged it off. Maybe another hiker had passed through here and left it behind. No big deal. Then I found the bones. They were scattered in the underbrush, picked clean and sun-bleached. Too big to be a squirrel or rabbit. Maybe a deer, I told myself. But they didn't look like deer bones. The shapes were wrong, longer, thinner. I couldn't place what animal they might have come from, and it unsettled me. I decided to head back to camp. When I returned to the clearing, something felt off. My fire pit had been disturbed. The stones I'd arranged in a circle around the ashes were scattered, and the ashes themselves had been spread across the ground. My tent looked untouched, but the flap was unzipped. I froze, listening. The forest felt different, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but the soft gurgle of the creek. My heart thudded in my chest as I scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and small. No response. I stood there for a long moment, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe the wind had scattered the ashes. Maybe I'd forgotten to zip the tent in my rush to head out that morning. But deep down, I knew better. I rebuilt the fire, trying to shake the unease. As the flames grew, I kept glancing over my shoulder, my nerves on edge. I ate a quick dinner and retreated to my tent earlier than I'd planned. Sleep didn't come easy. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves outside my tent made my heart race. I told myself it was just animals. Raccoons or deer, nothing dangerous. I tried to focus on the sound of the creek, letting it lull me to sleep. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to total darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was pitch black. For a second, I lay there, trying to remember what had woken me. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound. Footsteps, not the quick, light steps of an animal. These were slow and heavy, crunching on the dry leaves outside my tent. They circled around me, stopping just behind my head. I held my breath, my pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps stopped. I waited, counting the seconds, afraid to move or make a sound. The silence stretched on, each moment heavier than the last. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen in place, but eventually exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, the fear felt almost silly in the daylight. Almost. I unzipped the tent cautiously and stepped outside, blinking in the early light. The clearing looked normal, no sign of anyone or anything. I told myself it had been a dream, just my imagination running wild in the dark. But then I noticed the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, pressed into the soft ground around my tent. Definitely human. I stood there, staring at them for a long time. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe a hiker had passed by during the night, unaware I was there. Weird, but not impossible. I packed up my gear quickly. The idea of spending another night out here suddenly felt like a bad one. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the trailhead. The hike back felt different. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves put me on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The trail that had felt so peaceful on the way in now felt suffocating. The trees pressed in on me, their shadows long and dark. My pack seemed heavier with every step. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. There was no one out here. It was just my imagination, fueled by the strange events of the past 2 days. But no matter how many times I repeated it, the feeling wouldn't go away. Then I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, something was hanging from a tree. I stopped, my stomach dropping. It was a bundle of sticks, tied together with what looked like twine, dangling from a low branch. I didn't go closer. I didn't need to. It was too deliberate, too intentional. A warning. I didn't think. I turned and started walking faster, almost jogging down the trail. My breath came in short gasps, and my legs burned, but I didn't stop. I just needed to get out of there. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I threw my pack into the back seat and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away. I've thought about that trip a lot since then, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just a series of strange coincidences. A disturbed fire pit, some old bones, footprints from another camper. But deep down, I know better. Someone was out there with me, watching, following, and for whatever reason, they decided to let me leave. I haven't been camping alone since. The sky was darkening fast, turning from pale blue to a muted gray as I set up camp deep in the woods. I was miles from any town or road, exactly where I wanted to be, alone, far away from everything. This solo trip was supposed to be my reset, a way to clear my mind. Just me, a tent, and the quiet hum of nature. I found a decent spot near a small creek, flat enough for my tent, with a good view of the forest stretching endlessly around me. Tall pines swayed gently in the breeze, their tops creaking softly. I wasn't in a designated campground, this was off the beaten path. The kind of place where no one could accidentally stumble upon you. I liked that idea at first. Being unreachable sounded like freedom. After pitching the tent and gathering some firewood, I lit a small fire, just enough to boil some water for my freeze-dried meal. The smell of smoke mixed with the clean scent of pine, and for a moment, everything felt right, peaceful. Night crept in faster than I expected. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the trees around me. I ate in silence, my ears tuned to every rustle and snap in the woods. Most of it was small animals, rabbits, maybe a deer, but every once in a while, something larger seemed to move through the undergrowth. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a raccoon. By the time I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The forest outside was pitch black, the kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face. I lay on my back, listening. The sound of the creek was comforting, a steady gurgle just a few yards away. Then came the first snap. It was close, closer than any of the other noises I had heard earlier. A sharp crack, like a branch being stepped on. I froze, holding my breath. Another snap. This time, it sounded even closer. I slowly reached for the flashlight beside me, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. I clicked it on, aiming the beam toward the tent flap. The pale light lit up the inside of the tent, but beyond it, the darkness swallowed everything. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, listening, my heart thudding in my chest. but the snapping stopped. Whatever it was, it seemed to be gone. I told myself it was probably just a deer moving through the woods, maybe curious about my campfire. Animals make noise all the time. No big deal. I turned off the flashlight and forced myself to relax, even though every instinct told me to stay alert. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke up to total silence. Not the soft, natural quiet of the woods, but a thick, oppressive silence. The kind that makes your skin crawl. Even the creek seemed muted. I checked my phone. It was just past 2:30 a.m. I lay still, listening, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. My pulse was still racing, but there was nothing. No wind, no animal sounds. Just nothing. Then I heard it again. Faint, rhythmic sound. Soft at first, like something brushing against the tent fabric. I sat up slowly, my breath caught in my throat. The sound grew louder, more distinct. A dragging noise right outside the tent. I grabbed the flashlight again, flicking it on. The inside of the tent lit up, but the zipper stayed closed. I stared at it, waiting for something to move, something to press against the fabric. But nothing happened. I forced myself to breathe. There's nothing, I told myself. Maybe the wind picking up. Maybe something in the trees. Anything but what my mind was starting to picture. But deep down, I knew there was no wind. I sat there for hours, gripping the flashlight, listening. Every so often, I'd hear a faint rustle or a soft thump, but nothing as distinct as before. Eventually, the sky began to lighten. First gray, then pale orange. Morning. I unzipped the tent slowly, peeking out. The forest was calm, bathed in soft morning light. Nothing seemed out of place. The fire pit was cold, the ground undisturbed. But just a few feet from the tent, I saw it. A single footprint. It wasn't a boot print. It was bare, human. The toes were clear, pressed into the dirt, the heel digging deep like someone had stepped carefully, deliberately. My stomach turned. It was too big to be mine. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was an old print, but I knew that wasn't true. The ground was soft from last night's rain. That print was fresh. I packed up in record time. Every few minutes, I'd glance around, expecting to see someone watching from the trees. But there was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze, the creek gurgling like it always did. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I just threw everything into my pack and started hiking back toward the road, constantly looking over my shoulder. The trail felt different in the daylight, less threatening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every crack of a branch made me jump. Every bird call made my heart race. I covered the miles back to my car faster than I ever thought possible. When I finally reached it, parked at the trailhead, I tossed my pack in the back seat and locked the doors. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding for hours. I sat there for a long time, staring at the trees. Nothing moved.
No strange sounds.
Just the quiet hum of the forest, like it had all been a bad dream. But when I turned the key in the ignition, ready to leave, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror one last time. And for just a split second, I thought I saw someone, standing at the edge of the trees watching. But when I blinked, they were gone. I don't know what really happened that night, and I don't think I ever will. But one thing's for sure, I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. I've always loved camping. There's something about getting away from everything. Just the trees, the cold air, and nothing but your own thoughts for company. Clears my head in a way nothing else does. So when I got a couple of days off work, I decided to head out into the woods on my own. I had a spot in mind, a little out of the way, but not too far off the beaten path. a small clearing by a river that I'd stumbled on a year before while hiking with friends. I'd been wanting to camp there ever since. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. I figured it'd just be a quick overnight trip. Plenty of time to check back in later. I threw my gear in the back of my car. Tent, sleeping bag, some food, a small camp stove, and a few other essentials. I always pack light but smart. I've done this enough times to know what I need and what I don't. After a quick check to make sure I had everything, I hit the road. The drive out was uneventful. Long stretches of highway gave way to narrower, winding roads through dense pine forests. The sky was a dull gray, thick clouds hanging low. The forecast said it might rain later, but I wasn't too worried. The rain has never bothered me much. I reached the trailhead around noon, parked, and set off into the woods. The air was cool, and the scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. I love that smell. Fresh, clean, like the world just hit reset. The trail was muddy in places from recent rains, but nothing I couldn't handle. My boots sank a little with each step, the sound of squelching mud mixing with the rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. The hike took about 2 hours. By the time I reached the clearing by the river, the sky had darkened even more. The water flowed steadily, its surface rippling in the wind. The spot was just as perfect as I remembered. Flat, open, with just enough tree cover to offer some shelter. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough to hear the river but far enough to avoid any potential flooding if the rain got heavy. It didn't take long to get camp set up. My tent went up smoothly, and soon I had a small fire going. I sat for a while, just listening to the river and watching the fire dance. The first couple of hours were peaceful. I cooked a quick meal, nothing fancy, just some instant noodles and coffee, and watched the light fade. The woods were quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you. I've always liked that silence, but that night, it felt different, heavier. It started drizzling around sunset, a light patter on the leaves overhead. I pulled on my rain jacket and added more wood to the fire, watching the flames hiss and spit in the rain. The drizzle turned into a steady rain not long after. I wasn't too worried. My tent was waterproof and I'd brought a tarp to cover my gear. I hunkered down by the fire for a while, but the rain picked up quickly, and soon it was coming down hard. The wind kicked up, sending sheets of rain through the clearing. I decided to call it a night. Crawling into the tent, I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and listened to the rain hammering against the nylon. It was comforting at first, like white noise, but after a while, it started to feel oppressive. The wind howled through the trees, and the sound of the river grew louder, almost like it was moving closer. I told myself it was just the storm amplifying everything. I must have fallen asleep at some point, but I woke up suddenly, heart pounding, wide awake. The rain had stopped, the tent was dark, and everything outside was dead silent. Not just quiet, silent. No wind, no river, no insects, nothing. I sat up, straining to hear anything. My breath felt too loud in the stillness. Something was off. I've spent enough time in the woods to know that silence like that isn't normal. It's the kind of quiet that makes your instincts sit up and take notice, the kind that says something's wrong. I stayed still for a long time, listening. Then I heard it. A faint crunch, like a footstep on wet leaves. Close, too close. My heart jumped into my throat. I held my breath, listening. Another crunch, this time just outside the tent. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. It had to be, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling with it in the dark. The beam flickered on, and I pointed it at the tent walls. The light cast strange shadows, making everything look distorted. I didn't see anything unusual, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I unzipped the tent slowly, peeking out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. The clearing was empty, or at least it looked empty. The trees stood like black sentinels against the dark sky, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The river gurgled softly in the background. Everything looked normal, but the feeling didn't go away. I stepped out of the tent, my boots sinking into the wet ground. I scanned the clearing with my flashlight, moving it slowly from side to side. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Then I saw it. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the edge of the clearing to my tent. They weren't mine. I'd been careful to avoid walking in that part of the clearing when I set up camp. These prints were different, larger, and spaced in a way that suggested whoever made them had been moving slowly, deliberately. They stopped just a few feet from my tent. My stomach turned. I stood there, staring at the prints, trying to make sense of it. My mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the thought of hiking back through the dark woods alone made my skin crawl. Instead, I added more wood to the fire, stoking it until the flames roared back to life. The warmth was reassuring, but it didn't do much to ease the knot in my chest. I sat by the fire for hours, clutching my flashlight and a small camping knife I kept for emergencies. My eyes darted constantly between the tree line and the river, searching for movement. The feeling of being watched never left. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I retreated to the tent again, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound set my nerves on edge. I kept imagining those footsteps, picturing someone standing just outside, watching, waiting. When I finally did sleep, it was fitful and filled with strange, disjointed dreams. I woke up at first light, groggy and disoriented. The fire had burned down to ash, and the clearing looked peaceful again, bathed in the soft light of dawn. The footprints were still there, though clear as ever. I packed up quickly, not bothering with breakfast. The feeling of unease lingered, and I couldn't shake the thought that I was still being watched. The hike back to the car was a blur. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the car, I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors before starting the engine. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't feel safe until I was miles down the road, the dense forest fading into open fields behind me. I never figured out who or what made those footprints. Part of me doesn't want to know. I've thought about it a lot since that night, replaying every detail, trying to make sense of it. But some things don't have neat explanations. I still go camping sometimes, but I'm more careful now. I stick to well-traveled trails, and I always tell someone where I'm going. I've learned to trust that little voice in the back of my mind, the one that says something's wrong. It's better to be cautious than to ignore it, because out there in the dark, you never really know who or what might be watching. I couldn't explain why I felt uneasy the moment I set up camp. Maybe it was how isolated the spot was, deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest trail. It wasn't my first solo camping trip. I'd done this countless times before, and I loved the solitude. But this time, something felt different. Not wrong, just off. It was late afternoon by the time I pitched my tent, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows through the dense trees. The spot seemed perfect at first glance. Flat ground, soft pine needles underfoot, and a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. A creek ran nearby, just loud enough to cover the faint rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. I built a fire and sat down to eat a simple meal, can chili heated over the flames. The warmth felt good against the cool breeze. By the time I finished eating, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest around me darkened quickly. The only light came from the fire, flickering against the trunks of the surrounding trees. I sat there for a while, staring into the flames. The silence pressed in harder than usual. Normally, the woods were alive at night. Crickets chirping, frogs calling, owls hooting from the treetops. But tonight it was dead quiet. Just the crackle of the fire and the faint gurgle of the creek. Nothing else. I told myself it was fine. Animals don't always follow a schedule. Maybe it was just one of those nights where everything stayed hidden. I drank some water, stretched, and tossed another log on the fire before heading into the tent. Inside, it was warm and cozy. I zipped up my sleeping bag, closed my eyes, and tried to relax. I must have drifted off for a little while, but something woke me. At first, I didn't know what it was. My eyes snapped open, and I lay there in the darkness, listening. A faint sound just outside the tent. A soft footstep on dry leaves. I held my breath. Maybe it was just a deer. I thought, they're common around here and they can get curious. I waited, listening for more movement. For a minute, there was nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing. Then, another crunch. Closer this time. Slow, deliberate. Not a deer. Deer don't move like that. This was something or someone walking. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting barely any light. I couldn't see anything outside the tent. My knife was in my backpack at the foot of my sleeping bag. I reached for it carefully, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps circled the tent. Once, twice, each step slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be noticed. I gripped the knife tightly, my palms sweaty. I thought about calling out, but something told me not to. Then, everything went silent again. I stayed there, frozen, listening for what felt like hours. Eventually, my breathing slowed, and the adrenaline faded just enough for exhaustion to take over. I don't remember falling back asleep, but when I woke up, it was dawn. The light filtered through the thin fabric of the tent, and the forest felt normal again. Birds chirping, squirrels rustling in the leaves. I unzipped the tent cautiously and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had been there. I convinced myself that it must have been an animal after all. Maybe a raccoon or a coyote. I packed up my gear, ready to move on to another spot. The uneasy feeling lingered, but I shook it off and told myself I was just being paranoid. This was supposed to be a relaxing trip, after all. The second night was worse. I found another campsite farther up the mountain, near a rocky outcrop with a good view of the valley below. It seemed even more remote than the first spot, which I liked. I set up camp, cooked dinner, and sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the view as the sun set. But as darkness fell, that same feeling returned, that sense of being watched. The forest went silent again. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the crackle of the fire. I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself it was nothing. I was just spooking myself after what happened the night before. But deep down, I knew better. I stayed up late, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight, gripping my knife. I didn't go into the tent until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. I zipped myself inside, keeping the knife close. I didn't sleep long. This time, the sound that woke me wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, right outside the tent. Slow, steady breathing, like someone standing just inches away from the thin fabric. I froze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I didn't dare move. I just lay there, clutching the knife, listening. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity. Then it stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I burst out of the tent, knife in hand, spinning around to see if anyone was there. Nothing.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I packed up my gear as fast as I could and started hiking back toward my car. The trail felt longer than I remembered. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept checking over my shoulder, but the woods were empty. It wasn't until I reached my car and locked the doors that I finally let out a breath. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. Just paranoia, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I haven't gone back into the woods since. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from any signs of civilization. It was the kind of place I had always imagined escaping to when life in the city became too much. This wasn't my first solo retreat, but it was the first time I had gone so far off the grid. I needed this, a complete break from noise, emails, and the hum of urban life. I arrived late in the afternoon. The gravel road leading up to the cabin had been rough, and my small car struggled to make the climb. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a sense of relief. It was modest but sturdy, made of dark wood that blended almost seamlessly into the forest surrounding it. A small porch wrapped around the front, and there was a single rocking chair sitting there, as if waiting for me. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs after the long drive. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. I stood for a moment, taking it all in. The cabin felt secluded, almost too secluded, but that was the point.
No distractions.
Just me, the woods, and a pile of books I had been meaning to read. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. The interior was just as rustic as the outside. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the furniture looked like it had been there for decades. The kitchen was small but functional, with an old gas stove and a single sink. There was a faint smell of wood smoke and something faintly metallic, like rust. After unpacking my things, I decided to explore the area around the cabin before it got dark. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out. The forest was dense, with towering trees that blocked out most of the evening light. The path leading away from the cabin was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and moss. I followed it for a while, stepping over fallen branches and ducking under low-hanging limbs. The air grew cooler as the sun dipped lower in the sky. About half a mile from the cabin, I found a small clearing. In the center was a fire pit surrounded by rocks. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Something about it felt off. I couldn't put my finger on why, but standing there gave me a sense of unease. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned back toward the cabin, deciding it was better to return before it got completely dark. By the time I made it back, the forest was shrouded in shadow. I locked the door behind me and set about making dinner. The cabin's electricity came from a small generator, and I didn't want to waste it, so I cooked on the gas stove by the light of a single lantern. The quiet was almost oppressive. I hadn't realized how accustomed I was to the constant background noise of city life. After eating, I settled into the armchair by the fireplace with a book. The silence pressed in on me, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I tried to focus on my reading, but my mind kept drifting back to the clearing I had found. There was something unnatural about it. I shook off the thought, convincing myself it was just my imagination. The first night passed uneventfully, though I slept fitfully. I woke up several times, startled by the sound of branches tapping against the windows. Each time, I reminded myself that I was alone out here. There was nothing to be afraid of. The next morning, I decided to explore further. I packed a small backpack with water and snacks, then set off down the same path I had taken the evening before. The forest felt different in the daylight, less menacing but still heavy with an unexplainable tension. I walked for hours, taking in the sights and sounds of the woods. Birds chirped overhead, and I spotted a few squirrels darting through the underbrush. Around midday, I stumbled upon an old, overgrown trail branching off the main path. Curiosity got the better of me and I followed it. The trail was narrow and difficult to navigate, but it eventually led me to an abandoned cabin. This one was much smaller than mine, and it was in a state of disrepair. The roof had partially collapsed, and the wooden walls were covered in moss and ivy. I stepped closer, peering through a broken window. Inside, I could see the remains of a table and a few chairs, all covered in a thick layer of dust. There were old cans and bottles scattered across the floor, as if whoever had lived here had left in a hurry. The same sense of unease I had felt in the clearing washed over me. I decided not to linger and made my way back to my cabin. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I sat by the fireplace, I thought I heard footsteps outside. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, I locked the door and windows before going to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the forest. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to the sound of something knocking on the front door. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The knocking came again. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the door. "Who's there?" I called out, but there was no response. I shone the flashlight through the window, but I couldn't see anything. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping a kitchen knife and jumping at every sound. The following morning, I found nothing outside the cabin to explain the knocking. No footprints, no signs of animals. I decided to cut my trip short. The isolation, which had initially seemed so appealing, now felt suffocating. I packed up my things and loaded them into the car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood silent and still, framed by the dense forest. I told myself I'd never come back, but a part of me wondered if I would ever truly leave it behind. The woods had a way of staying with you, creeping into your thoughts and dreams, long after you'd gone. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, a break from the constant noise of the city. Just me, some food, and a small cabin deep in the woods. I needed peace, and this cabin, far from everything and everyone, seemed like the perfect place to find it. I had rented it online. The description was simple: secluded cabin, ideal for reflection, surrounded by nature. I didn't expect much, just a tiny wooden structure in the middle of nowhere. When I pulled up to the place, I was a little surprised. It was much smaller than I thought. The cabin was old, the wood faded, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. But it had a certain charm, the kind of rustic charm you see in those offbeat places people go to get away from everything. I grabbed my bag from the trunk of my car, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The air smelled damp, a little musty, but not unpleasant. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved inside. It was a simple cabin with a small kitchen area, a single bedroom with a double bed, and a tiny bathroom. There was a stone fireplace on one wall, with a few logs stacked beside it. The kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen any visitors for months, maybe even years. I unpacked my things, hung up my jacket, and set my phone on the kitchen counter. No signal. Perfect, just the way I wanted it. I didn't need distractions. The woods outside were dense, the kind of forest that seemed to go on forever. Tall, thick trees with gnarled roots twisting out of the ground, and the occasional rustling sound that kept you on edge. But I figured I'd get used to it. The first night went by without incident. I lit the fireplace, roasted some marshmallows, and sat by the window, watching the shadows shift in the trees as night fell. It was quiet, almost eerily so. The kind of silence that seemed to press down on you, making you acutely aware of every little sound. At one point, I heard something scratching at the door. I froze, listening. It was faint, like claws dragging along the wood. I stood up slowly, heart pounding. I opened the door and stepped outside, but there was nothing. Just the cool night air and the empty woods. I shrugged it off, figuring it was some animal, maybe a raccoon or something. I went back inside, locked the door, and settled in for the night. Sleep came easily, and for a while I didn't even think about the strange noise. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside. The sun filtered through the gaps in the curtains, and for a moment, I felt completely at peace. I made coffee and stepped out onto the porch, taking in the fresh morning air. The forest seemed alive, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. It was beautiful, but as the day wore on, things started to feel off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I went for a walk in the woods, hoping the exercise would clear my mind. The trees towered over me, their branches intertwining above, blocking out much of the light. The ground was soft and damp, covered in layers of fallen leaves. As I walked, I kept hearing the occasional snap of twigs, as though someone or something was following me. I stopped, looked around, and nothing, just the trees. But the feeling didn't go away. I had this overwhelming sense that I was being watched. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But when I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it when I left. I stepped inside cautiously, checking every room, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, that uneasy feeling lingered. I spent the evening by the fire again, trying to relax, but every so often, I'd hear something outside, branches snapping, leaves crunching underfoot. At one point, I saw a figure moving between the trees in the distance, a shadow just out of reach of the cabin's lights. I squinted, but it was gone before I could focus on it. I told myself it was an animal or maybe just my imagination running wild. But something didn't sit right. That night, I slept fitfully, tossing and turning. The wind picked up, and I could hear it howling outside, rattling the windows and causing the trees to sway more violently. I woke up to the sound of scratching again, this time louder and closer. My heart raced. I lay perfectly still, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound stopped suddenly, and for a long moment, I didn't hear anything at all. Then, a soft thud on the door. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and opened the door, scanning the area outside. Nothing. The forest was silent again, but I knew something was off. I closed the door behind me, locked it, and pushed the furniture in front of it, just in case. The next morning, I was determined to leave. The unease had grown too strong. As I packed my things, I noticed more strange details. Footprints in the mud around the cabin, but they weren't animal tracks. They looked like human footprints, bare feet, but they were faint, as if someone had been walking in and out of the cabin without leaving much of a trace. I was about to get in my car and leave when I noticed something near the edge of the woods, something shiny reflecting in the sunlight. I walked over, curiosity getting the better of me. It was a small, old-fashioned pocket watch, the kind you might see in a movie. It was dusty, like it had been buried in the ground for years. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and froze. The back was scratched up, but there was one clear engraving on it. My name. I stood there, my heart racing. How could this be? I hadn't seen this watch before, and yet there it was, in the middle of nowhere with my name on it. I was done. Whatever was happening here, I didn't want any part of it. I drove off, not looking back, not stopping until I was miles away. When I got home, I immediately checked my bags, hoping I hadn't just imagined it all. But sure enough, the pocket watch was still in my coat pocket. I don't know what happened in that cabin or who, if anyone, had been there with me, but I don't think I'll ever truly know. The only thing I know for sure is that I'll never go back. And I'll never forget that feeling of being watched, of hearing things I couldn't explain, and of seeing something I didn't understand. But as I sit here, writing this, I can't shake the feeling that maybe I haven't seen the last of that cabin. Because sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can hear the sound of scratching at my door. I wasn't sure what possessed me to book a weekend getaway alone in a remote cabin, tucked deep in the woods. Maybe I needed a break from the constant noise of city life or the stress that had been piling on me. My friends thought it was a bad idea, saying things like, "Aren't you scared?" Or, "What if something happens to you?" But I was determined. It was going to be a quiet, peaceful escape, just me and the forest. The drive to the cabin took hours, the winding roads narrowing as I left the town behind, and I could feel the isolation settle in. By the time I arrived, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the woods. The cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, a little worn but with a charm that made it look like something out of a dream. It had a woodsy, weathered look, like it had been there for decades. I stepped out of my car, feeling the cool air hit me, the scent of pine trees mixed with the dampness of the earth. My boots crunched on the gravel as I approached the cabin door. The keys were hidden in a lockbox, just like the owner had told me. I grabbed the key and let myself inside. The place was exactly as it was described, simple, rustic. There was a stone fireplace in the center of the room, a small kitchen off to one side, and a loft above with a queen-size bed. Everything was in its place, a little dusty but otherwise cozy. The walls were adorned with old, faded pictures, the kind you find in thrift stores. It wasn't luxurious, but that was exactly what I was looking for. Peace, quiet, and a break from the world. I unpacked my things, made a cup of coffee, and sat by the fire. As the flames flickered, I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. The wind outside howled, and the trees creaked with the pressure, but I was warm inside. I felt safe. The night passed without incident. I spent it reading, thinking, and enjoying the solitude. But as the fire died down, I noticed something strange. It was a soft noise at first, barely perceptible. A thump, like something or someone was walking around outside. I shrugged it off. It was probably an animal. The woods were full of creatures, after all. But then it came again, louder this time. A scraping sound against the side of the cabin. I stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the blackness. There was nothing there, just the trees swaying in the wind. I tried to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe an animal was scratching at the wood. The noises stopped for a while, and I convinced myself to go to bed. It was just a random sound, nothing to worry about. The next morning, I woke to find the sun shining brightly through the window. The whole cabin was bathed in golden light. For a moment, everything felt normal again. I got dressed, made breakfast, and sat at the table, enjoying the view of the forest. But as I looked out the window, I noticed something odd. There were marks in the dirt right outside the cabin. Scratches like something had been dragged along the ground. My heart began to race. I stepped outside, walking cautiously to inspect the marks. They led toward the back of the cabin, and I followed them, trying not to panic. At the back of the cabin, near the edge of the woods, I found something that made my stomach turn. There was a section of the cabin's wooden wall that looked off. The boards were cracked, and one had been torn away, leaving a jagged hole. It wasn't big, but it was enough to let someone or something slip inside. I felt a rush of cold fear flood my chest. The noises last night, the scraping. What if someone had been trying to get in? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a weathered spot in the cabin structure, something natural. But something about the hole didn't feel right. The edges were too clean, too deliberate. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. I was alone in the woods, miles from anyone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one here anymore. I spent the rest of the day checking the windows and the door every few minutes, but I didn't see anything. Still, the unease gnawed at me, and every time the wind howled or a branch snapped, I jumped. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I had come here for peace, not to feel like I was being watched. That evening, as darkness crept back into the forest, I sat by the fire again, hoping to find some comfort in the warmth. I tried to distract myself, pulling out my phone to check the weather forecast. The screen flashed for a second, then went blank. I checked the battery, it was full. I tried turning it back on, but it stayed dead. Weird, I thought. Maybe I dropped it too hard earlier, or maybe it was a glitch. But as I put the phone down, I noticed something strange. A small rock lay in front of the fireplace, right in the center of the room. It hadn't been there before. I was certain of it. The cabin's floor wasn't clean enough to have missed it earlier, and it wasn't something I would have overlooked. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My first instinct was to pick it up and throw it out, but I paused. The room felt too still, too quiet. I couldn't explain why, but I had the distinct feeling that something, or someone, had been inside while I wasn't paying attention. I couldn't sit still anymore. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. I grabbed my jacket and went outside to check the perimeter of the cabin. But as soon as I stepped out the door, I froze. The air was unnaturally still, and the woods seemed unervingly silent. Not a single bird, not even a rustle of leaves. I turned around slowly, my gaze landing on the trees behind the cabin, and that's when I saw it. There was a figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its form almost blending with the shadows. My heart hammered in my chest, and I instinctively took a step back. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring. I didn't know if it was human or some kind of animal, but the feeling of being watched overwhelmed me. I backed away from the edge of the cabin, stepping back inside and slamming the door shut behind me. I locked every window and door and sat in the dark, my back pressed against the wall. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the silence returned. The woods outside seemed to come alive again with the sounds of wind and distant creatures. I sat in the dim glow of the fire, too terrified to sleep, too restless to move. In the morning, I packed up my things. The cabin, with its eerie stillness, felt like a trap, and I didn't want to stay another minute. I didn't bother checking the windows or the door. I just wanted to leave. I grabbed my keys, and with shaking hands, I started the car. As I drove away, I glanced at the cabin one last time in the rearview mirror. The place looked untouched, almost peaceful in the morning light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't, that there was something out there, something that wasn't meant to be found. I didn't know what had happened there. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe the isolation had gotten to me. But as I left the woods behind, I knew I wouldn't be coming back. I had always wanted to escape the noise of the city for a while, a brief break to recharge. So when I found a small cabin nestled deep in the woods, I knew it was the perfect spot for me. The listing described it as isolated, a small getaway surrounded by trees, with no one around for miles. The perfect place to disconnect from everything. I booked it without hesitation. The drive up was long, the kind of winding roads that seemed to stretch on forever. As the city slowly faded into the rearview mirror, the surroundings began to shift. The buildings gave way to forests, the trees growing taller and thicker, closing in around me. There was something calming about it, the slow hum of the engine and the sound of my tires crunching on the gravel roads. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. When I finally reached the cabin, it felt like I had stepped into another world. The place was exactly as described. Small, quaint, and surrounded by towering pines. There was a porch with a couple of old chairs, and the air smelled of damp wood and earth. The cabin itself was made of logs, weathered by time, with a stone chimney puffing out a thin wisp of smoke. I unloaded my stuff and stepped inside. It was cozy, simple furniture, an old wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen with everything I'd need for a few days. There was a fireplace on the far wall, and a large window that gave a perfect view of the woods beyond. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over everything. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the light fade. The forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The kind of quiet where you could hear the faint rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig, but nothing else. It was a little unsettling at first, but I chalked it up to being in a new place. The first night went by without incident. I cooked a simple dinner, read a book, and went to bed early. The bed was comfortable, and I quickly fell asleep, the quietness outside wrapping around me like a blanket. But around 3 a.m., I woke up. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a shift in the air, like something had changed. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening. I could hear the wind picking up outside, the trees creaking with it. Then I heard it. A faint tapping sound came from the window. I froze, unsure if I had heard it correctly. The wind could cause strange noises, I reasoned. Maybe it was just a branch tapping against the glass. But then it came again, this time louder.
Top, top, top.
I felt my heart skip a beat. I slowly got out of bed and crept to the window. The faint glow of the moon lit up the forest outside, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, swaying gently in the wind. No one around. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. The tapping had stopped. I went back to bed, trying to shake the unease from my mind. I convinced myself it was nothing, just the forest playing tricks on me. But sleep didn't come easily after that. Every little sound seemed amplified. The creak of the cabin settling, the wind howling through the trees. It felt like the woods were watching me. I finally drifted off, but the rest of the night was fitful. The next day, I decided to go for a hike. I figured some fresh air would do me good and help clear my mind. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and set off into the woods, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The forest was thick, and the further I went, the quieter it became. There was no wildlife, no birds singing, no animals rustling in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I walked for hours, enjoying the solitude. The path eventually began to narrow, and I found myself in a part of the woods I hadn't seen before. The trees grew closer together, their branches twisting in odd angles. The air felt cooler here, the sunlight dimming as the canopy thickened. I looked around, realizing I had no idea where I was anymore. The trail had disappeared, swallowed by the dense woods. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed different now. The trees looked unfamiliar, the shadows longer, darker. My heart started to race as I realized I was lost. I hadn't seen a trail marker in ages. The quietness of the woods felt oppressive now, like something was wrong. I kept walking, hoping I'd find my way back, but every direction seemed the same. The trees stretched out endlessly in all directions. I was starting to panic, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to think. I couldn't afford to get lost completely. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted a clearing. I rushed toward it, desperate for some sign of civilization. The ground was soft beneath my boots, the underbrush thick with ferns and moss. And then I saw it. A broken fence, rusted and decaying. Beyond it was the remains of an old cabin. Its roof caved in, its windows shattered. It was an abandoned cabin, just like the one I had rented, except this one had been left to rot. The sight sent a chill down my spine. I approached cautiously, stepping over the fence and into the overgrown yard. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The walls of the cabin were falling apart, and the wooden beams groaned under the weight of time. I walked around the back of the cabin, my mind racing. There was no way I was imagining it. This had to be part of the same property. I had to be near the cabin I was staying in. But something didn't feel right. The place felt wrong, like something had happened here, something that wasn't supposed to be remembered. I turned to leave but stopped. There was a small shed behind the cabin, half hidden by the overgrown vines. Something about it called to me. I walked over and pushed the door open. Inside, it was dark, but I could make out the shape of a wooden crate in the corner. I approached it, my curiosity getting the better of me. The crate was old, the wood brittle. I pried it open, my hands trembling. Inside, there were clothes dirty, torn, and stained. But there was something else. A small journal. I picked it up, feeling a strange weight in my chest. It was old, the pages yellowed and crumbling. I flipped it open, the words barely legible. It was a diary, written by someone who had stayed here long before me. The entries were erratic, full of fear and desperation. The person spoke of strange noises in the woods, of things watching them at night, of feeling trapped in the cabin, unable to leave. They wrote about hearing footsteps outside, but when they checked, no one was there. And then one entry stopped mid-sentence, leaving only a smear of ink. I quickly slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding. This wasn't just some old cabin. It was a place that had seen something terrible. I needed to get out of there. I ran back to the main cabin as fast as I could, my legs aching, my mind racing. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees casting long, twisted shadows. I stumbled back onto the familiar trail, relief flooding through me when I saw the cabin in the distance. When I returned to the cabin, I locked all the doors and windows, not caring how silly it seemed. The silence outside was deafening, and the thought of spending another night there was unbearable. I didn't know what had happened in those woods, what had happened to the person who had written that journal, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I packed my bags and left, not even bothering to take a second look at the place. The drive back to the city felt like a rush of freedom. The roads that had seemed so eerie the day before now felt like a lifeline. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, safe and sound. The woods were beautiful, but they held secrets. Secrets I wasn't ready to uncover. And as much as I wanted to forget about that abandoned cabin and the strange diary, I knew I would never forget the feeling of being watched, of being trapped in a place that didn't want me there. It wasn't just a cabin in the woods. It was a warning. It had been years since I'd gone camping. Life had gotten in the way, work, responsibilities, all the things that kept me chained to routine. But one weekend, I decided enough was enough. I wanted to get away from it all, just for a bit. No phone, no obligations, just me, nature, and silence. I found a cabin in the middle of nowhere, on the outskirts of a national forest. It was an old, rustic place, one that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. There was no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove and a single flashlight. The reviews were sparse, but the ones that were there talked about its peacefulness and isolation. Perfect, I thought. I needed to be alone, and I wanted to disconnect. The drive there was longer than I anticipated. The forest was thick with trees that stretched as far as the eye could see. casting long shadows even though it was still early afternoon. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and a little damp. It felt good to be out of the city, away from the noise and the chaos. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. It looked exactly as advertised, wooden, aged, and tucked into a small clearing. There was a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs and a wooden path leading into the forest. I grabbed my backpack, which was full of camping gear, food, and some books. The cabin had a single room with a loft, a small kitchen, and a fireplace. Basic, but I didn't need anything more. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I immediately felt the chill of the air inside. The place smelled musty, like old wood and dust, but I didn't mind. I closed the door behind me and began to unpack. Felt good to settle in. I started a fire in the stove, making sure to get it going well before the night fully set in. The night came fast, and with it, an eerie quiet. No animals, no wind rustling the trees, just an unnatural stillness. I didn't think much of it. It was the forest, after all. It was supposed to be quiet. I ate a quick dinner, some canned beans and a granola bar, and settled into the rocking chair by the fire. I had a book with me, but the flickering flames and the shadows on the walls kept pulling my attention away. I tried to read, but it was hard to focus. My eyes kept wandering to the dark corners of the cabin, to the long shadows outside the windows. Every so often, I'd hear a creak or a groan from the walls, but I attributed it to the old wood settling. It was normal for a cabin like this, right? But then, around midnight, I heard something that wasn't normal. A knock. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like someone tapping on the cabin door. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen anyone on the drive-in. There was no one around for miles. I stood up, slowly, unsure of what to do. The knock came again, this time more urgent. I wasn't sure if I should open the door or just pretend I didn't hear it. The last thing I wanted was for someone to show up out here in the middle of nowhere. I approached the door cautiously, peeking through the small window beside it. There was no one there, just the dark expanse of the forest. My breath released in a shaky exhale. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, a branch or something. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. I backed away from the door and went back to the fireplace, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. I figured it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me in the isolation of the cabin. But the sound of the knocking wouldn't leave my thoughts. I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing strange noises. The occasional tap against the door, followed by a scratching sound, like something was trying to claw its way in. I gripped the edge of the blanket tighter, my pulse racing. I knew it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. By morning, I was exhausted. The night had felt endless, and the knocking had stopped only when the first light of dawn peeked through the trees. I didn't want to leave the cabin, but I figured I'd take a quick walk around, clear my head. I needed to get out of the cabin and remind myself that nothing was wrong. I stepped outside, and the crisp air hit me, grounding me a bit. The forest was beautiful in the morning light. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns on the ground. It was quiet, too quiet that I walked down the path a little ways, keeping close to the cabin. The forest around me felt dense, thick with trees that blocked out most of the sky. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was nothing, just trees, rocks, and the occasional bird. I wandered for a while, lost in thought, until I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh ones. They were large and looked like they had been made by boots. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen anyone come by. The only way these prints could have appeared was if someone had been following me. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get back to the cabin and lock the door. But I didn't want to appear panicked. I didn't want to make a rash decision and make things worse. So, I turned around slowly, walked back down the path, and entered the cabin. The cabin felt colder than before. I checked the windows, making sure they were all locked. The door was secure, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to make a plan. I could stay inside, keep an eye on things, and wait for the sun to set. Or I could pack up and leave, get out of there while I still could. I didn't feel like I was in immediate danger, but the thought of someone lurking around outside, someone who knew I was alone, made my skin crawl. The thought of going back to the car and driving away seemed more appealing every second. I sat by the fire for a long time, thinking. When night came again, I was more on edge than ever. The knocking started again, just like before. Only this time it was louder, more insistent. The door rattled as if something was pressing against it, trying to get in. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it through the cracks in the door, but I saw nothing. No figure standing in the dark. No sign of anyone outside. But the knocking didn't stop. It was like someone was trying to break the door down. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow. I knew I had to act fast. I couldn't just sit there and wait for something to happen. I had to take control. I grabbed my backpack and stuffed it with essentials. Food, water, a flashlight, and my phone. Even though there was no service out here. I wasn't sure where I would go, but I knew I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. The knocking continued, louder now, as if it was shaking the walls. I opened the back door quietly, careful not to make a sound. The cold air hit me immediately, but I didn't hesitate. I bolted for the woods. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back, not caring where I was going. The trees rushed past me, the sounds of the cabin fading behind me. I didn't stop until I found a small creek, and I knelt by it, gasping for air, my heart still racing. I realized then that I had no idea what had been knocking on the cabin door. Was it someone playing a prank? Or was it something more sinister? I couldn't answer that, but what I did know was that I wasn't going back. Not there, not ever again. I stayed by the creek for hours, just listening to the sounds of the forest. Eventually, I made my way back to my car, my nerves still shot. When I finally drove away from the cabin, I didn't look back. I didn't want to. There was no need to. I made it back to the nearest town before dark, my mind still reeling from the experience. I don't know what was going on at that cabin. I don't know who or what was knocking on the door, but I do know this. I'm never going camping alone again. The woods were too quiet, the cabin too isolated. I thought I was looking for peace, but what I found instead was something I wasn't ready to understand. I'm just glad I made it out of there in one piece, and I haven't thought about that cabin since. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still hear that knocking in my mind, and it still scares me. I had never been one to shy away from the wilderness. In fact, I welcomed the solitude and peace that came with the isolation of the forest. It was the perfect escape, away from the hustle of daily life, from the constant noise, from the nagging distractions that seemed to follow me everywhere. The cabin I rented for the weekend was the ideal spot for some much-needed alone time, nestled deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. It was small but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, wooden floors, and thick log walls that gave it a cozy, rustic feel. I arrived just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the landscape. The air was crisp, and the wind carried with it the earthy scent of pine. The road leading up to the cabin was rough, unpaved, and bordered by dense trees. It took a while to get there, but the isolation felt almost reassuring. There would be no one around for miles, just me, the forest, and the quiet. The cabin was in better shape than I expected. Well-maintained, sturdy, and even had a small porch with a couple of chairs. After unloading my stuff, I grabbed a beer from the cooler and sat down to enjoy the evening, watching the sky slowly turn dark. The night crept in quickly, and soon the only light came from the flickering orange of the fireplace inside the cabin. The night was peaceful at first, with only the occasional rustle of leaves outside, perhaps a squirrel or a deer moving through the underbrush. The air inside was warm from the fire, and I felt at ease. I cooked myself a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just some pasta and salad. The sounds of the forest were distant but present, like the low hum of the world beyond. But after a while, I began to notice something off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a creeping sensation, like someone was watching me. At first, I chalked it up to the isolation, to the stillness of the night. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, but there was something else, an unnatural stillness between the gusts, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, I was alone in a remote cabin. Of course, I'd be more aware of every sound, every movement. But then I heard it, footsteps, faint but distinct. They weren't from the forest. They came from just outside the cabin. I froze. My heart began to race. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was quiet again. I waited, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a bear, moving through the area. But the sensation of being watched didn't go away. I spent the rest of the night on edge, unable to fully relax. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees, made my heart skip a beat. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. I locked the doors, bolted the windows, and pulled the blankets up around my shoulders. I tried to sleep, but the sense of unease kept me awake. The footsteps, the silence between the wind's gusts, the way the forest seemed to have gone still. It all weighed on me. The next morning, I woke up groggy and tired. The sun had already risen, casting a pale light through the cabin windows. The air outside was chilly, but the day promised to be clear. I made some coffee and sat on the porch, trying to shake off the strange feeling from the night before. The forest looked peaceful again, bathed in soft sunlight. Birds chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled the leaves above. I spent most of the day hiking around the area, enjoying the quiet beauty of the forest. The trees were tall and dense, the ground soft with moss and pine needles. I didn't see anyone else the entire day, which only added to the feeling of isolation. But despite the beauty, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. That night, I made sure to double-check the locks and the windows before bed. I didn't want to take any chances. As I lay in bed, the night seemed unnaturally quiet. No wind, no animal sounds, just the sound of my own breathing. It was as though the forest had completely shut down, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then I heard it again. The footsteps. This time they were closer, more deliberate. They weren't from the forest. They came from just outside the cabin again. I could hear the crunch of the gravel on the ground, the soft tap of boots against the porch. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it had to be an animal, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and carefully crept toward the window. I peeked through the blinds, scanning the porch. First, I saw nothing. The moonlight cast long shadows, but the porch was empty. I breathed a sigh of relief, but just as I turned away from the window, I heard the unmistakable sound of the cabin door handle turning. I froze. The door was locked. I was sure of it, but the handle turned again, and then there was a faint scraping sound, as if someone was trying to force the door open. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. There was no one else out here. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed my phone and called the only number I could think of, the local sheriff. But the call didn't go through. There was no signal. I was cut off. The scraping stopped. I could hear nothing but the pounding of my own heart. I dared not move. If someone was out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake. I stayed as still as possible, listening for any sound. Minutes passed, and then I heard the footsteps again, retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound, every creak, every whisper of the wind made me jump. At dawn, I decided to pack up and leave. I wasn't taking any more chances. I threw my things into the car as quickly as I could, looking over my shoulder the entire time. The forest was still and silent. There were no signs of anyone around. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been near the cabin. But something about the way the trees stood, tall and dark, felt different. They felt watchful. As I pulled away from the cabin and headed back down the rough road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was small in the distance, barely visible among the trees. But for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the window. A shadow, perhaps, or maybe just my imagination. But that feeling, the one that had lingered with me all weekend, didn't go away. It stayed with me long after I left the woods, long after I was back in the bustle of everyday life. I still think about that cabin sometimes, about the strange noises, the feeling of being watched. It's been months since I left, and I've never been back, and maybe I never will. The night I arrived at the cabin, everything seemed perfect. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the forest around the cabin looked like something out of a postcard. A small, isolated cabin, tucked deep in the woods, far away from the bustling noise of the city. Just what I needed after weeks of feeling overwhelmed with work and personal life. The drive up had been long, but it was worth it. The forest was thick, the kind of place you could get lost in easily if you weren't careful. The gravel driveway leading to the cabin was narrow, and there were no other houses in sight. Just trees, trees, and more trees. It was as peaceful as it was remote. I parked my car in front of the cabin and took a deep breath, feeling the cool mountain air fill my lungs. I was ready for some quiet. No phone signal, no internet. Just me and the wilderness. I grabbed my bag, got out of the car, and locked it behind me. The cabin had a rustic charm. Wooden walls, a stone chimney, and a porch that stretched out along the front. There was an old rocking chair on the porch, which creaked slightly as I approached it. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. The door creaked open as I pushed it, and inside was exactly what I expected. Wooden beams, an old-fashioned wood-burning stove in the corner, and a small kitchen area. It smelled faintly of pine and something earthy, like the forest itself had somehow seeped inside. The floors creaked underfoot as I set my things down and took in the surroundings. It was cozy. A small sofa, a wooden table, and a few chairs scattered around the room. Nothing fancy, just functional. A fireplace on the far wall caught my attention, and I could already imagine myself curling up in front of it later, reading a book or just listening to the crackling of the fire. I didn't waste much time unpacking. I was eager to get settled and make a fire. It wasn't cold yet, but I knew it would get chilly as the night wore on. The firewood was neatly stacked next to the stove, ready for use. The matches were in the kitchen, and I quickly got to work. As I crouched in front of the stove, arranging the wood just right, I noticed something strange. A small, faded piece of paper was wedged behind one of the logs. I pulled it out and unfolded it carefully. The paper was old, brittle at the edges, and yellowed with age. Written in dark ink were a few words: "Don't go outside at night." I stared at the words for a long moment. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me a strange feeling. I wasn't one to be easily spooked, but something about those words, written so simply, unsettled me. Maybe it was just an old warning, left behind by someone who had stayed here before. Maybe it didn't mean anything at all. I shook my head and tucked the note into my bag, deciding to not let it bother me. The fire crackled to life soon after, and I sat back, feeling the warmth spread through the room. The flickering flames cast shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere that was both peaceful and comforting. I grabbed a book from my bag and settled into the armchair. Time seemed to slow down in that cabin, like the outside world didn't exist. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves outside as a breeze moved through the trees. I must have lost track of time because before I knew it, night had fully set in. I glanced outside through the window, and all I could see was darkness. The kind of darkness that seems to stretch on forever, with no moon or stars to break it up. It felt like the forest had swallowed the cabin whole. I stood up and stretched, thinking about calling it a night. The bed was inviting, and I was already feeling the pull of sleep. As I walked toward the bedroom, something caught my attention. The rocking chair on the porch, the one I had seen earlier, was moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, back and forth. I paused, my heart rate quickening. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, but then I realized that the wind wasn't strong enough to move a chair like that. The motion was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone or something was sitting in it, rocking gently. I shook my head again, trying to dismiss the thought. It was probably just the wind after all. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned away from the window, heading back to the fire to take a moment to calm myself. I didn't want to let my imagination get the best of me, but there was something about that movement that didn't sit right. I closed the curtains and sat back down by the fire. The room felt warmer now, and the fire's crackle was comforting. I tried to focus on the book in my lap, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even inside the cabin. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up with a start. The cabin was still dark, and the fire had long since burned out. I could hear the sound of the wind outside, howling through the trees. It wasn't just a gentle breeze anymore. The wind had picked up, and it sounded like it was whipping around the cabin, rattling the windows. I sat up, my heart racing. The feeling of being watched had returned, but this time it was stronger. There was something outside, something I couldn't see but could feel. The darkness outside seemed to press in against the cabin, as though the trees themselves were closing in. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to stay inside, to lock the door and wait for morning. But there was something in the air, something that made me feel like I had to get out. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to go. Maybe it was the note, maybe it was the way the chair moved, or maybe it was just the strange, oppressive feeling that had settled over me. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cold, biting at my skin. The wind whipped around me, and I could hear the trees groaning, bending under the pressure of the storm. I looked around, trying to make sense of what I was feeling. The forest was silent now, almost too silent. The kind of silence that made you feel like you were no longer welcome. I walked to the edge of the porch, my eyes scanning the dark forest. Every tree, every shadow seemed to hold something. A movement caught my eye, something small and fast darting between the trees. I froze. It was a figure, just a flash of motion, too quick to make out clearly, but it was there. I took a deep breath, telling myself I was just imagining things, but the feeling, that sense of being watched, wouldn't leave. The cabin, the forest, everything seemed to close in on me. I had to get away. I turned to go back inside when I heard it. A soft sound, barely audible over the wind. Tapping. I froze again, listening. came from behind me, from the woods. Slow, deliberate tapping, like something or someone was knocking on a tree. My breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly, trying to shake off the panic that was rising. There was nothing there, just the dark woods stretching out endlessly before me. But that sound, that tapping, it was still in my ears, even though I couldn't hear it anymore. I ran inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it. The cabin felt suffocating now, like it was no longer a refuge but a prison. I tried to calm myself, tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid. But I knew something was wrong. The night passed slowly. I didn't sleep. Every noise outside made me jump. Every creak of the cabin made me tense. By morning, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. When the sun finally rose, the world outside looked different. The forest was still, silent in the early light. The storm had passed, and the air felt fresh again. But the cabin felt different too. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like something had changed. I left that morning, not looking back as I drove away. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. Even as I drove down the narrow gravel road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. The cabin was a memory now, a strange, unsettling memory. I don't know what happened that night or why I felt so uneasy, but I do know one thing: I'm never going back. I'd always loved the idea of escaping to a cabin in the woods. Something about being surrounded by nothing but trees, the scent of pine, and the silence that blankets everything. It felt like the perfect way to recharge. I had seen pictures of these remote cabins, small and cozy, tucked away in corners of nature where no one would bother you. No cell service.
No distractions.
Just me and the wilderness. It wasn't an easy decision to make. My friends had been encouraging me to take a trip for weeks, urging me to disconnect for a bit. After a year of chaotic work schedules and constant emails, I finally gave in and booked the cabin. I found a small one up in the hills, about 2 hours outside the city. It looked perfect, nothing too fancy, but the kind of place where you could truly get away. The owner had left a note online, saying it was secluded, no neighbors for miles. I thought that sounded ideal. I packed my car, loaded up with enough food for a week, and set out for the cabin early on a Friday morning. The drive was peaceful at first. I passed familiar suburbs, then gradually, the roads became more narrow and winding. The trees grew denser, the sky gray with the promise of rain. I followed a series of signs and dirt roads that twisted and turned. I'd been driving for over an hour when I began to question whether I had made the right decision. The road, barely wide enough for one car, seemed to shrink the further I went. Eventually, I saw the cabin. It was nestled into a clearing, its wooden walls blending with the surrounding forest. The rain had started to fall heavier by then, but it didn't bother me. The sound of raindrops against the trees was calming, like the woods themselves were breathing. I pulled up to the cabin and parked my car beside the porch. The place had an old charm to it, with a steep roof and a small front porch. There was a rusted swing chair on the porch, which creaked in the wind. I stepped out, grabbed my bags, and walked up the steps. The door was unlocked, just as the owner had promised. I pushed it open, and the smell of wood and dust filled the air. The cabin was exactly as I'd hoped. Rustic, but comfortable. The living room had a stone fireplace, a couple of armchairs, and a big, worn couch. The floors creaked under my feet as I walked through the space, checking out the small kitchen and bathroom. It was a small, modest place, but it would be perfect for a week alone. I unpacked my things, threw my jacket over the back of a chair, and settled down on the couch, feeling the tension of the city start to fade away. The first night was uneventful. I made myself a simple dinner, watched the fire crackle in the hearth, and read a book for a bit. As the evening wore on, the wind picked up, howling through the trees outside. The cabin groaned with the pressure of the storm, but it wasn't anything to worry about, just nature doing its thing. The second day started with a thick fog that rolled through the woods. I made some coffee, stepped outside to enjoy the cool morning air, and took in the view of the surrounding forest. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet where you feel like you're the only one left in the world. I decided to go for a hike. The weather had cleared up, but the air was still damp from the rain. I followed a trail that started just beyond the cabin. The path was narrow, winding between trees. It wasn't long before the only sounds I could hear were my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. After an hour of walking, I stopped for a break. I found a fallen log, sat down, and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, and the forest around me felt alive. I felt completely alone, but in a good way. For the first time in a long while, I could hear myself think. But then, a sound broke through the stillness. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting branches, but it was too deliberate. A crunching sound, like footsteps, far off in the distance. I froze, listening intently. The woods were dense, so it was hard to tell exactly where the sound had come from. I glanced around, but there was no movement, nothing that would suggest someone was out here with me. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear moving through the underbrush. But as I stood up to continue my hike, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the sound. It was the sense of being watched, like someone or something was following me. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the unease lingered. I made my way back to the cabin, the feeling of being followed growing with every step. When I reached the clearing near the cabin, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The sense of unease faded a little, but it still clung to me like an unwanted shadow. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to distract myself. I made lunch, watched the fire burn down, and even played a game of solitaire. The daylight hours passed in a slow, comfortable haze, but the creeping feeling of being watched never fully left me. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I decided to stay inside for the night. I locked all the windows and doors, drew the curtains, and settled in for a quiet evening. But the next morning, I woke up to something that would change everything. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest that greeted me. It was a soft scratching noise coming from somewhere outside the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or some other animal, but then it happened again. Soft, deliberate, and consistent. I lay still in bed, listening. The scratching was at the door. I sat up, heart racing. I was alone, no one should be out there. The owner had mentioned that the cabin was isolated. There were no other houses for miles. But still, that scratching, it was unmistakable. I forced myself to get out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and moved quietly toward the door. The scratching stopped as I approached. I hesitated for a moment, then peered out the window. Nothing, just trees. The mist from the morning fog hung thick in the air, and the world outside was still and silent. I checked the door. No signs of forced entry, no broken locks. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. Someone had been watching. The rest of the day passed without incident. But that night, as I sat in front of the fire, I noticed something odd. The front porch light flickered, then went out completely. I hadn't touched it, and I hadn't heard the usual hum of the electric system failing. It was as though something had just turned it off. I waited for a few moments, expecting the light to come back on, but it didn't. At that point, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched anymore. The sounds, the strange occurrences, it was all building up. I checked every window and door again. Everything was locked, but the unease didn't leave. The wind picked up again, and the rain started to fall harder, tapping against the roof like 1,000 tiny fingers. I curled up on the couch, trying to distract myself with the book, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Was someone out there? Had I just imagined everything? Or was there something or someone lurking in the woods, watching, waiting? I stayed awake most of the night, listening to every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every drop of rain. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. The next morning, I decided to leave. Something in me had changed overnight. I couldn't explain it, but I just felt like it wasn't safe anymore. I packed up my things in a hurry, grabbed my keys, and left the cabin behind. The drive back home was a blur. I didn't stop, didn't look back. As I passed the winding roads, the trees closing in on me, I realized that some places, no matter how peaceful they look, hold secrets that are better left uncovered. And maybe, just maybe, it was better I never found out what was really lurking in the woods. I had always wanted to take a break from the bustle of everyday life, to escape to a cabin in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees, quiet, and my own thoughts. A friend of mine told me about a secluded cabin up in the mountains, far from the nearest town, a place to be truly alone. I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to recharge, take some time off, and explore the outdoors. Little did I know that this cabin would become the place where I would face something I never expected: fear. I arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon. The weather was cool but comfortable, with the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest, with a small dirt road leading to it. The trees around it were tall and thick, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was exactly what I had imagined: a small wooden cabin with a rustic feel. The windows were big enough to let in light, but small enough to make the place feel cozy. A small porch wrapped around the front of the cabin, with a few rocking chairs placed along it. The setting was perfect, and I felt a wave of calm wash over me. I unpacked my things and made myself at home, settling into the small but comfortable living room. The cabin was old, but not in a bad way. It had that weathered charm, the kind that comes with age and use. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, the walls were lined with wooden beams, and there was an old stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The smell of pine and fresh air filled the cabin, and I couldn't help but smile to myself. I was alone, and that was exactly how I wanted it. No distractions, no noise, just me and the wilderness. After a quick dinner, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I grabbed my jacket, tied my boots, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The forest was dense, the trees towering above me like silent giants. The ground was soft beneath my feet, covered in layers of fallen leaves and pine needles. I walked for a while, following a narrow path that wound its way deeper into the woods. The only sounds I could hear were the rustling of the leaves in the wind and the occasional bird call. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. I kept walking until the path began to disappear, swallowed up by the thick undergrowth. At that point, I decided to turn back and head toward the cabin. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air seemed heavier, the silence more profound. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, a subtle tension in the air that made me uneasy. I hurried my pace, eager to get back to the safety of the cabin. When I finally returned, it was almost dark. I locked the door behind me, ensuring all the windows were closed. I didn't know why I felt so uneasy, but I tried to brush it off. I started a fire in the fireplace, hoping the warmth and light would ease my mind. The fire crackled and popped, filling the cabin with a comforting glow. I settled onto the couch, watching the flames dance in the hearth, trying to relax. But the unsettling feeling lingered. I kept hearing faint noises, cracking, rustling, coming from outside, as if something was moving through the woods. But every time I glanced out the window, the darkness outside was still, the trees standing motionless against the night sky. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound seemed to make me jump, every creak of the floorboards or snap of a twig outside sending my heart racing. But I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the natural sounds of the woods. After all, I was alone, and nothing was out there, or so I told myself. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds singing outside. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light through the windows. I stretched and yawned, grateful for the daylight, as if the sun had somehow dispelled the lingering unease from the night before. I decided to head out again, this time with the goal of hiking up to the top of the nearby hill for a better view of the surrounding area. The climb was challenging, but not unbearable. The trail was steep in some places, but the air was fresh, and I could smell the earth beneath my boots as I made my way up. After a while, I reached the top. From there, I could see for miles the vast expanse of the forest stretching out in every direction. It was beautiful, serene, and peaceful. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the night before. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the distance, there was something moving through the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but it didn't move like one. It was too deliberate, too human in its pace. The shape was indistinct, hidden among the trees, but I could make out the silhouette of a figure moving in the direction of the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was someone else out here? How had they found this cabin? I quickly descended the hill, my breath coming in short gasps as I hurried back toward the cabin. The thought of someone else being out here so far from civilization made my skin crawl. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just another hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. When I arrived back at the cabin, I immediately checked the windows and doors. Everything seemed secure, but the unsettling feeling was back, stronger than ever. I decided to wait inside, not daring to venture out again. I couldn't shake the thought of that figure moving through the woods, and the longer I sat in the cabin, the more I felt like I was being watched. As night fell, the sounds of the forest grew louder. The wind howled through the trees, and the occasional snap of a twig echoed through the air. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that it was just my imagination running wild. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I stayed up late that night, keeping a watchful eye on the windows, my nerves on edge. Every crackling sound from the woods sent me into a state of alert. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I finally drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A tapping, like fingers on glass. I bolted upright, my heart racing. I didn't dare move for a moment, straining to listen. The sound came again, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from outside the cabin. I slowly crept to the window, my hands trembling as I pulled back the curtain. Nothing. The tapping stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, but there was nothing. The woods were quiet once again. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was out there, something I couldn't explain. That I spent the rest of the day inside, not daring to go out. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to pack up and leave just yet. Something about the cabin, the place, the isolation had a hold on me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I needed to stay just a little longer. By evening, the tapping had stopped. The strange presence outside seemed to fade, and the peace of the forest returned. I finally allowed myself to relax, and the tension that had been building in my chest began to ease. Maybe I had overreacted, Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I made myself a hot meal, settled by the fire, and forced myself to enjoy the moment of calm. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in days. The unease, the fear, it had all faded away, replaced by the warmth of the fire and the quiet comfort of the cabin. The next morning, I packed up and left, making my way back down the trail toward the town. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The place that had felt so isolating, so strange, now seemed peaceful in the morning light. I still couldn't explain the things I had experienced there, the noises, the figure in the woods, but I was sure of one thing. I wouldn't be returning anytime soon. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been watching me, I had no intention of finding out. The road back to town was quiet, and the sun shone brightly overhead. I felt lighter, more at ease as I left the woods behind. I didn't know what had really happened at the cabin, but I knew that I had faced something that had made me realize just how vulnerable I could be out there, in the middle of nowhere. And that was enough for me. I had always wanted to escape to the mountains, to find a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach me, where I could just breathe and let go of everything. That's why, when I found this secluded cabin tucked away in a dense forest, I thought it was the perfect getaway. The pictures online looked peaceful, and the owner had assured me it was isolated enough that I wouldn't have to worry about anyone disturbing me. The drive was long and winding. It took me through narrow roads flanked by towering trees that blocked out the sun. It wasn't exactly a comfortable ride, but I didn't mind it. I welcomed the isolation, the quiet. The further I drove, the more I felt like I was getting away from the chaos of my everyday life. The cabin finally came into view just as the sun was setting. It sat on the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees and a creek that ran through the woods. It looked even more isolated than the pictures had shown, which only made me more excited. No neighbors, no distractions, just peace. I pulled up to the front of the cabin and unloaded my things, taking in the crisp mountain air as I did so. The front door creaked as I opened it, revealing a simple but cozy interior. The smell of aged wood and fresh pine filled my lungs. There was a stone fireplace against one wall, a small kitchen area, and a loft with a bed. The windows were large, giving a perfect view of the forest that stretched out into the distance. I decided to make myself a cup of coffee before unpacking. As I sat at the small kitchen table, I could hear nothing but the sound of the creek outside and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Felt perfect. But as night started to fall, things began to feel different. The quiet was heavier, more suffocating. The wind picked up, and the trees outside began to creak and groan. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the normal sounds of the woods. Still, I felt a strange sense of unease creeping in. I spent the next hour settling in, making the cabin feel more like home. I unpacked my clothes, stacked some firewood near the fireplace, and lit a fire to warm up the space. The flames flickered and crackled, casting shadows on the walls. I sat by the fire, sipping my coffee, trying to enjoy the peace I had come here for. But there was something in the back of my mind that wouldn't let me relax. It was like I was being watched, even though I knew I was alone. It was then that I heard it, a soft scratching noise from the back of the cabin, coming from the side door. It was so faint at first that I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, a little louder this time. I froze, listening intently. The sound was slow, deliberate, like something was dragging against the wood. I stood up and moved toward the back door, my heart starting to race. The wind was still howling outside, and the trees were swaying, but the scratching noise didn't stop. I reached for the door handle and pulled it open cautiously. There was nothing there, just the dark woods stretching out into the distance. I breathed a sigh of relief and started to close the door when I noticed something on the ground. A small pile of dirt, like something had been digging or scratching at the earth. I knelt down, studying it. The soil was disturbed, and it didn't look like it had been there long. I could feel my nerves starting to fray. I shut the door and locked it, double-checking the other windows and doors. Everything seemed secure, but the uneasy feeling remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, even though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I spent the next few hours in the cabin, trying to distract myself. I read a book by the fire, made dinner, and even went outside for a walk around the perimeter of the cabin. But no matter how much I tried to calm myself, I couldn't get rid of the tension building in my chest. As the night wore on, I decided to go to bed early. I climbed into the loft, pulling the covers up to my chin, hoping sleep would ease my nerves. The fire below crackled and popped, but soon I heard nothing but the sound of my own breathing. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. The scratching. This time it was louder, closer. My eyes snapped open, and my heart began to race. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The sound was coming from the side of the cabin again, but it was different this time. It was more frantic, like whatever was out there was trying to get in. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept down the stairs, my bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The light from the flashlight trembled in my hand as I approached the door. I shone it through the window, but there was nothing there. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees. I could see the branches swaying violently, casting strange shadows on the walls of the cabin. I took a deep breath and opened the door. There was nothing in the yard, no sign of any animals or people. But as I scanned the darkness, something caught my eye. A faint trail in the dirt, leading into the woods. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakable. Something had been moving out there, and it hadn't been an animal. The footsteps were too deliberate, too spaced out. I stood there for a long moment, weighing my options. The logical thing would have been to stay inside and lock the door, but the fear gnawing at my insides told me that whatever was out there wasn't going to leave me alone. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and decided to follow the trail. The woods were thick, and the ground was uneven, but I pressed on, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The further I walked, the more the trail seemed to wind and twist, leading me deeper into the forest. It felt like hours before I finally stopped. The trail led me to a small clearing, where the ground was soft and wet. The moonlight shone through the trees, revealing something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the clearing, was an old, weathered shack. It wasn't much bigger than the cabin, but it looked abandoned. The wood was rotting and the windows were broken, but the door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I stood there for a long time, staring at the shack. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't turn back. The trail had led me here for a reason, and I had to know what that reason was. I approached the shack slowly, the door creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, and the floor was covered in dust and debris. I moved cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the dark corners of the room. And then I saw it, a pile of clothes in the corner, covered in dirt and leaves. But as I stepped closer, I realized they weren't just clothes. They were rags, torn and stained with something that looked like blood. My heart hammered in my chest as I stumbled backward, the light from my flashlight flickering. I had to get out of here, fast. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I froze. The scratching sound was back, louder than ever. It was coming from behind me, from within the shack. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand. The room was empty, except for the pile of rags. But the scratching kept getting louder, more frantic, as if whatever was inside was trying to break free. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I bolted out of the shack, not daring to look back. I ran through the woods, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I stumbled over roots and rocks. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me. My hands were shaking, and I could barely catch my breath. But I was safe. Whatever it wasn't out there anymore. I sat in the corner of the cabin, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But the woods were silent again. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the steady creaking of the cabin. I knew I had to leave in the morning. I couldn't stay here anymore. But for now, I just needed to calm down, to breathe. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, hoping I could sleep. But I knew deep down that I would never forget the terror I had felt that night. The scratching, the abandoned shack, and the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness. I left the cabin the next morning, and I never came back. The woods were too quiet, too suffocating, and I knew I would never be able to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. I never found out who or what had been living in the shack, or what had been scratching at my door. But one thing was certain: I wouldn't be returning to that place again. I had escaped, and I intended to keep it that way.